Gun? That was her boyfriend, a part-time security guard with a full-time ego, who fancied himself a cop. They thought they ran the place, right up until they picked a fight with the wrong veteran's family. I moved to Whispering Pines seeking peace. The cul-de-sacs, manicured hedges, and monthly potlucks featuring slightly overcooked casseroles and suspiciously identical bundt cakes promised a quiet life. My husband and I, Martha, were freshly retired, dreaming of mornings spent sipping coffee, watching birds, and enjoying the tranquility of our golden years. The place seemed perfect, a little slice of heaven to live out our days in peace. But nobody warned us about Eleanor, the creeping shadow over that tranquility. At first, her maneuvers seemed petty, almost laughable. Passive-aggressive notes about our flagpole allegedly being too tall per HOA Article 4.3, or complaints that our decorative garden gnome was non-compliant. We laughed it off, figuring maybe she was just bored or lonely in her regimented world. But boredom couldn't explain the fines that started appearing with increasing frequency. $7 for the wrong mailbox handle, $200 for an unapproved variation in garage door paint. Power had fallen into her lap, and she knew it. She wielded it ruthlessly. Eleanor was the classic case of someone who ran for HOA president unopposed simply because nobody else wanted the thankless job, our first mistake, letting her stroll into power. Once elected, she quickly rewrote the bylaws to ensure no one else could easily challenge her position. She chaired every meeting, single-handedly changed voting procedures, and ruthlessly shut down any neighbor who dared question her autocratic vision. She wasn't just a neighbor anymore, she was a regime. 2 years into her reign, she'd morphed from handling mundane HOA tasks like newsletters and holiday banners into a suburban Napoleon, rewriting covenants like she was carving commandments onto stone tablets, turning our peaceful haven into her personal fiefdom. Then Eleanor acquired Gary, her self-styled constable boyfriend. He wasn't an official member of the Homeowners Association, and definitely not actual police, but that didn't stop him. Suddenly, Gary was everywhere. He rigged up an old golf cart, slapped some homemade flashing lights on it to resemble a patrol vehicle, and started cruising Whispering Pines like he was the law. He scrutinized everything, from trash placement to tiny sidewalk cracks, then knocked on doors in the name of HOA compliance enforcement. Some neighbors, perhaps intimidated or simply wanting to avoid trouble, played along with this unwanted attention. But others, unnerved by his presence and arrogant attitude, started locking their gates tighter. The atmosphere in the neighborhood began to shift, the facade of peace slowly replaced by an uncomfortable feeling of being watched. In the midst of this, my son, Daniel, came home from deployment. Daniel's a quiet guy, keeps mostly to himself. He always helped me with the lawn on Sundays and was polite to a fault, calling everyone ma'am, even our old cat. But Eleanor took an immediate dislike to Daniel. She started complaining that he looked shady, that his F-250 truck was oversized for the community parked in our driveway. She even implied the American flag we flew from our porch was somehow a hostile display, according to some obscure interpretation of the rules only she understood. At first, we tried to ignore her pettiness and minor aggressions, hoping she'd eventually get bored. But then the fines started arriving in a barrage, ridiculous sums for imaginary violations, and we knew we couldn't stay silent forever. However, things truly exploded and escalated to a dangerous new level when Gary decided to unilaterally expand his patrol jurisdiction. My daughter, Sarah, had just driven home. She's in the military, an elite Army Ranger, and had just finished a grueling 48-hour shift at the base. Exhausted, mindset only on rest, the last thing Sarah needed was to deal with an HOA clown playing sheriff. As Sarah's car turned onto the main road leading into the subdivision, Gary abruptly drove his golf cart into the middle of the street, blocking her path. He got out, posture full of self-importance, and strode directly to Sarah's driver's side door. His right hand rested deliberately on the handgun holstered at his hip, a real firearm, though he had absolutely no legal authority to carry or use it in his self-appointed role. "Papers?" Gary demanded, his voice dripping with condescension, looking at Sarah as if she were an intruder. Sarah, despite her exhaustion, calmly lowered her window. Not a flicker of fear or hesitation showed on her face. Instead, her sharp eyes, trained to observe and assess situations, quickly scanned Gary from head to toe. Her gaze lingered for a second on the gun and the cheap plastic security badge he wore proudly on his chest. Then she looked Gary straight in the eye, her voice quiet but carrying a cold, steely authority. "Who are you, And by what authority are you stopping my vehicle on this road? Gary seemed taken aback by the calm, direct response. Sarah's unwavering confidence was not what he expected. He floundered slightly but tried to maintain his superior air. I'm Whispering Pines HOA security. I need to see your identification. You are not law enforcement. Sarah replied instantly, her voice even, devoid of emotion but emphasizing every word. This is a public access road into the subdivision, not private HOA property at this junction. You have no legal authority whatsoever to arbitrarily detain a citizen's vehicle. And placing your hand on a weapon while approaching a non-threatening individual is blatant intimidation and an abuse of the symbol of authority. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze unwavering. Would you like me to call 911 so actual police officers can clarify the authority you seem to think you possess? The military bearing radiating from Sarah, her absolute composure under pressure, combined with the legally precise words, felt like needles piercing Gary's fragile ego. He visibly faltered. He took an instinctive step back, his hand flying off the gun. The smugness evaporated, replaced by flustered, repressed anger. He mumbled something incoherent about routine security checks, and then reluctantly waved Sarah through. Sarah gave a slight nod, said nothing more, rolled up her window, and drove straight home, leaving Gary standing alone in the road with his golf cart and his badly bruised ego, his abuse of power ruthlessly exposed by a soldier. That evening, hearing Sarah recount the incident, I knew for certain Gary wouldn't let this humiliation stand, and Eleanor, fed his undoubtedly distorted version of events, would only find more reason to escalate her war against my family. Things were only just beginning to get truly ugly. After the confrontation between Sarah and Gary, it seemed Whispering Pines' self-appointed power couple only became more determined. Eleanor and Gary began more frequent patrols, walking the neighborhood together like a two-person army. They came fully equipped, Eleanor with her ubiquitous clipboard, Gary with a digital camera always ready to capture any infraction. And what I swear looked like a carefully laminated copy of the HOA covenants and restrictions, CC and RS, which they treated like their personal Bible. They didn't hesitate to knock on doors, photograph the most minor things, and issue citations for every imaginable reason, from slightly sun-faded shutter paint to patio cushions deemed non-compliant with the neutral color palette mandate. Eleanor proudly called it Operation Community Beautification Enforcement. We, and many other neighbors, called it what it was, an oppressive suburban surveillance state and an invasion of privacy. Throughout this time, Daniel, my son, remained outwardly silent after his sister's incident. But silence didn't mean inaction. I started noticing him logging more hours on his laptop, keys clicking away, reading intently, researching deeply. It turned out, the entire HOA rulebook and meeting minutes are public record if you know where to look. Daniel, with his military-trained photographic memory and meticulous attention to detail, was quietly building a massive dossier, screenshots of conflicting rules, notes on the dates of Eleanor's questionable decisions, and evidence of selective enforcement. Then one day, seeking a small measure of peace amid the constant tension, Daniel decided to hang a simple bird feeder from the old oak tree in our front yard. It was his way of relaxing, sitting quietly in the morning, coffee cup in hand, watching the cardinals and blue jays flit about freely. But that small patch of tranquility was like a red flag to Eleanor. She materialized almost instantly. "That's not HOA approved," she declared flatly, her voice thick with authority. "Article 6.8b prohibits unauthorized wildlife attractants." Daniel calmly pointed towards 3 other houses within view, where similar bird feeders hung. "Are you finding them?" he asked. Eleanor smirked, a knowing, unpleasant smile. "They're on the list," she replied curtly. Exactly 3 days later, a $300 citation arrived in our mailbox. Daniel just looked at the paper, showing no flicker of fear or anger. He simply said one word: "Okay." With Daniel, okay never meant acceptance. It meant game on. And game on it was. In retaliation, Eleanor had surveillance cameras installed on HOA common ground, but aimed directly at our yard and front door. She claimed it was a community security measure, but their sole target was clearly our family. We couldn't just sit back. Daniel, after triple-checking the bylaws, executed Operation Pine Straw. We bought bales of pine straw and covered the entire front yard. The action was perfectly legal according to the current HOA regulations. Eleanor was furious. She accused us of landscape aggression. Immediately, she convened an emergency board meeting. A meeting attended only by herself as both chair and sole voting member present. There, she proposed and passed a new regulation. The use of natural organic ground cover on lawns without prior written approval from the executive board is strictly prohibited. The motion passed with a single vote, hers. Daniel filed an appeal. She denied it. He appealed again. She sent another $500 fine. That's when I caught Daniel in the garage, carefully organizing a stack of documents thicker than a phone book. I asked him nervously what he was doing. "Just getting prepared, Mom," he replied calmly. "Sometimes the quietest person in the room is just waiting their turn." Eleanor's tyranny wasn't just aimed at my family. The neighborhood was showing visible cracks. The Millers were fined for installing, unapproved, window tinting film. The DeVises received a citation because their flag placement was too close to the curb. Even poor Mrs. Peterson, an 84-year-old nearly blind widow, was cited for excessive algae accumulation in her bird bath. But fear had taken hold. People were afraid to speak up. Eleanor had expertly manipulated proxy votes, rewritten meeting rules, and made herself de facto president for life. She had Gary as her armed enforcer. She had her self-made rulebook. She had her clipboard, which wielded far more power than it had any right to. But there was one thing she didn't have, and couldn't control: Daniel and Sarah. As summer arrived, the air in Whispering Pines grew heavy. What was once a quiet subdivision now felt like a miniature Cold War zone. Neighbors no longer chatted out in their yards. Instead, they exchanged hushed, wary whispers over fences. Lawns were manicured with almost military precision, not out of pride of ownership, but out of fear of Eleanor's citations. You could almost feel the judgmental gaze of her clipboard lurking, waiting for any minor slip-up. We thought she couldn't possibly invent any more absurd rules. But then Eleanor found a new target, one that finally shattered our tolerance: our family dog, Buddy. Buddy is an ancient, 12-year-old golden retriever with arthritis and a classic squirrel phobia. He's so gentle he wouldn't dare take a cookie unless specifically offered. But that didn't stop Eleanor. She filed a formal complaint for aggressive animal behavior, because Buddy had barked exactly once, not at a person, not at a child or neighbor, but at a squirrel taunting him from a tree. Eleanor cited Article 7.12, declared it a serious noise disturbance, and sent us a $200 fine accompanied by a chilling threat. "One more violation, and animal control will be notified for removal." That was the straw that broke the camel's back. For the first time in years, I saw something other than calm resolve on Daniel's face. His jaw tightened. My son had endured horrors in far-off places he never spoke about in detail, had faced real danger. Yet, the only time I ever saw his hand tremble slightly with rage was when Eleanor dared threaten the safety of our loyal old dog. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He sat at the printer, churning out page after page of every single HOA regulation ever enacted in Whispering Pines. He took a red pen and highlighted every violation Eleanor herself had overlooked on her own property: the non-compliant paving stones, the fact she kept 2 trash cans instead of the mandated one, even a small backyard shed built without the required permit. And then, he did something I knew would change everything. He got up, took a slim folder of documents, and started knocking on neighbors' doors. It turned out, the neighbors who seemed silenced by fear weren't entirely silent after all. They were just waiting for a spark. Daniel wasn't the only one quietly documenting Eleanor and Gary's abuses. The Davis family down the street had an audio recording of Gary making inappropriate and threatening comments during one of his self-appointed yard compliance checks. The Millers across the street had security camera footage of Eleanor, late at night, furtively tampering with their landscape decorations, plants she later fined them for letting die and becoming an eyesore. Even sweet Mrs. Peterson, the frail widow, had carefully saved every ridiculous citation she'd received, 27 in total, all suspiciously vague about the specific infraction. Daniel went house to house, listening to every story, collecting every piece of evidence. He compiled it all into a detailed, 48-page dossier, each entry meticulously labeled with dates and times. Then, he drove straight to the county HOA management office. And something unexpected happened. When an HOA goes truly rogue, and when multiple households present well-documented, systematic evidence, people in charge start to listen. Especially when the person leading the charge is a decorated veteran, whose family includes another member currently serving in elite forces. Daniel formally filed the complaint, detailing the systemic abuse of power, the blatant conflicts of interest involving Eleanor and Gary, and more seriously, the potential violations of residents' civil rights. The turning point had arrived. The fight wasn't just ours anymore. A week after Daniel filed the complaint with the county, Eleanor decided to strike back the only way she knew how, by calling an emergency HOA meeting at the community clubhouse. The clear intent was to consolidate her power and condemn the troublemakers. Naturally, our family received no invitation. But that didn't stop Daniel. He decided he would attend. When he walked into the meeting room, he wasn't in civilian clothes, he wore his military reserve uniform. Not for intimidation, but as a silent reminder of who he was, of the service and discipline he represented. He chose a chair in the very back row, sat down silently, and observed. Eleanor stood at the podium, launching into her familiar spiel. She pontificated about the importance of compliance, about the disruptive elements, undermining community harmony, and about the need for even stricter controls. The tension in the room was palpable. Some people nodded along, others stared at the floor. Midway through Eleanor's impassioned speech, Daniel calmly raised his hand. When Eleanor reluctantly called on him, Daniel stood up, his voice clear and steady, resonating through the quiet room. "Madam President," he began, "could you please explain to the community how HOA funds were used for the installation of surveillance cameras pointed exclusively at my family's property? This was done without any community vote, without prior notification, and, as far as I can tell, without a legal installation permit as required by the county." Eleanor froze, blinking rapidly. A few whispers started rippling through the room. Someone in the front row gasped audibly. Without waiting for Eleanor's answer, Daniel pulled a sheet of paper from the slim folder he carried, a copy of an HOA bank statement. "Page 6, he stated evenly. "Check number 4889, drawn from the HOA account for security equipment. Equipment installed without board approval or member notification." Eleanor stammered something about emergency powers and community security, but her words sounded weak, unconvincing. The atmosphere in the room had completely shifted. The murmurs were louder now. People turned to look at each other, then stared intently at Eleanor on the podium. Daniel didn't need to say anything more. He quietly leaned back in his chair, letting the truth sink in. Eleanor couldn't tolerate this public challenge and the crumbling of her authority. Rage and humiliation boiled within her. The very next morning, Gary appeared at our front door again. This time he wasn't alone. Eleanor stood right behind him, her face a mask of fury. They dropped all pretense of patrolling. They stated bluntly they were there to respond to a report of a serious landscape violation. The harmless bird feeder in the oak tree. They demanded Daniel remove it immediately. Daniel stood on the porch, calmly refusing. He stated the bird feeder violated no rules and he would not be taking it down. That's when Gary lost control. Fueled by blind rage and the previous day's humiliation, he strode directly onto my lawn. And then, the unthinkable happened. Gary drew his handgun from its hip holster and pointed it directly at Daniel. No warning, no justification, just raw, weaponized shame in a self-made security costume. Eleanor stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, a flicker of a triumphant smirk crossing her lips, as if witnessing the decisive victory in her self-created power game. But Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't step back. He showed no fear. He looked straight down the barrel, then into Gary's eyes, his voice remaining astonishingly calm. "It's all on camera," he stated clearly. And it was. Gary's insane act was being recorded not from one, but from 3 different angles. Our doorbell security camera, the small body cam Daniel had started wearing after Sarah's incident, and surprisingly, the cell phone of a neighbor across the street who had witnessed the entire thing unfold and quietly started recording. There was one crucial thing neither Eleanor nor Gary knew. After the continued harassment, Daniel had filed for a restraining order 2 days prior. And the temporary protective order, TPO, barring both Gary and Eleanor from approaching or harassing my family, had been approved by the court and went into effect that very morning. This meant that the instant Gary stepped onto my lawn, he was in direct violation of a court order. And his act of drawing a gun on Daniel, fully recorded, constituted aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. Less than an hour later, county sheriff's cruisers, real law enforcement, screeched to a halt in front of our house. They weren't there for Daniel. They were there for Gary. Before the eyes of neighbors now curiously peering out their windows, Gary was handcuffed right there on my front lawn for violating a protective order and aggravated assault. Eleanor shrieked in panic, trying to shield Gary, ranting that Daniel had set them up. But no one was buying her story anymore. The looks on the neighbors' faces weren't fear now, but contempt and outrage. In the chaos, the familiar clipboard slipped from Eleanor's trembling arm, clattering onto the sidewalk with a dry smack. It lay there, a symbol of her fallen power. Daniel bent down and picked it up. He glanced at the top page, and then a slight smile touched his lips. Because, ironically, right there on that page was clear evidence, Eleanor's signature approving monthly salary payments from HOA funds to herself, for an amount triple the maximum allowed by the association's own bylaws and state law. The fight on the lawn might have been over, but Eleanor's complete downfall was just beginning. After Gary was hauled away in handcuffs from our front lawn, you might think Eleanor would finally learn fear, back down, and maybe, just maybe, recognize her errors. But no. For people like Eleanor, retreat is never an option. Instead of silence, she doubled down in a desperate attempt to control the narrative and salvage her crumbling authority. She drafted and blasted out an HOA newsletter, dramatically titled, "Maintaining Order in Turbulent Times." In it, showing zero remorse, she brazenly accused our family of aggressive behavior, claimed Daniel had staged a false incident to slander her and Gary. Worse, she implied our unpatriotic actions, referring to our resistance against her rule, were threatening the safety and harmony of Whispering Pines. Accusing a veteran and his active duty military family of being unpatriotic? The audacity of the woman knew no bounds. But that very email, dripping with indignation and self-defense, became her biggest mistake, the final blow to her HOA career. Because in her panic and fury, Eleanor didn't just send it to the residents. She also CC'd the entire county HOA oversight board and, incredibly, the lawyer Daniel had just retained. Yes, Daniel now had legal counsel. Not just any neighborhood dispute lawyer, but a renowned civil rights bulldog known for his tenacity, specializing in cases involving HOA overreach, illegal surveillance, and violations of members' rights. It turned out Eleanor's actions, and her mighty clipboard, weren't just annoying or upsetting. They were flat-out illegal. Using community funds for unapproved personal purchases? Illegal. Installing surveillance equipment targeting private property without consent or a court order? Illegal. Manipulating and falsifying board votes through proxy harvesting? Extremely illegal. Daniel and his tough lawyers systemized it all: the fabricated citations, the budget reports showing signs of tampering, the footage of Eleanor sabotaging landscaping under cover of darkness, and the HOA rulebook itself, which Eleanor had rewritten multiple times, riddled with contradictory dates and suspicious digital timestamps indicating forgery. They even subpoenaed detailed HOA financial records. And within that paper trail, they struck gold, finding irrefutable proof. Eleanor had been paying herself a hefty, undisclosed, management stipend, every month, consistently for the past 3 years. The total came to over $18,000. All of it unapproved by the board, unauthorized by the bylaws, and completely hidden from the members. It was the kill shot. When the county board finally convened a formal hearing regarding the allegations against Eleanor, it was procedurally scheduled as a closed session. But news of the situation had spread like wildfire through Whispering Pines. On the day of the hearing, so many residents showed up at the county building that the proceedings had to be moved to the town library's large auditorium. Extra folding chairs were needed everywhere. Many people carried printouts of the absurd citations they'd received. One man even brought the non-compliant garden gnome Eleanor had confiscated as evidence. Daniel sat in the front row with his lawyer. Eleanor walked in, still trying to project an air of sophistication with her pearl necklace, as if attending a routine meeting rather than facing total ruin. She carried 2 yellow legal pads, her expression unapologetic. But one thing she didn't bring: a lawyer. Because even at this late stage, Eleanor delusionally believed she could talk her way out of anything with sheer confidence and spin. Another fatal mistake. The room fell silent as Daniel was called to present. He didn't shout, didn't show anger or emotion. In a calm, clear voice, he laid out Eleanor's violations one by one, each claim backed by documented proof, exact timestamps, and irrefutable visual evidence. He showed a brief video montage compiled from neighbors' contributions, footage of Gary yelling at an elderly resident, Eleanor caught ripping down the Miller's Halloween decorations at 2 a.m., and an audio recording of an HOA board meeting where Eleanor clearly cast 3 votes for herself using obviously falsified proxy ballots. Gasps filled the room. A woman in the middle rows clutched her own pearls. Sweat began to bead on Eleanor's forehead. Finally, Daniel placed a thick, carefully bound dossier on the hearing board's table, titled, "The Chronicle of Abuse, Whispering Pines HOA, 2020 to 2024. Inside was everything: screenshots of threatening emails, audio recordings, financial proof of embezzled funds, and even a signed affidavit from a former HOA treasurer who had been bullied into resigning 2 years prior by Eleanor. It was the final nail in Eleanor's power coffin. The county board recessed for about 40 minutes for private deliberation. When they returned, the lead investigator chairing the hearing stepped to the microphone and minced no words. His voice was cold and decisive. "Ms. Eleanor Thompson, based on the evidence presented, you are hereby immediately removed from all positions on the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association Board of Directors, effective immediately. A subsequent criminal investigation regarding allegations of embezzlement will be referred to and handled by the county prosecutor's office." Eleanor shot to her feet, her face pale with shock and rage. "You can't do this to me!" she screamed. "I built this community!" But instead of silence or agreement, the entire room erupted in thunderous applause. Someone yelled from the back, "You built it on lies and fear!" Eleanor, losing all composure, spun around and bolted from the auditorium. In her haste, the clipboard once again tumbled from her grasp. This time, it stayed there on the floor. Nobody bothered to pick it up for her. Her reign was well and truly over. After Eleanor's dramatic and public downfall at the county HOA hearing, you might breathe a sigh of relief and think it was finally over. That the nightmare of the HOA dictatorship had passed. But you'd be wrong. For people like Eleanor, admitting defeat is never an option. She wasn't about to disappear quietly. Exactly 2 weeks after her humiliating removal from office, Eleanor made her final move, a desperate attempt at revenge and perhaps a cash grab. She filed an audacious civil lawsuit against not just my family, but the entire Whispering Pines subdivision. The suit accused us, the collective neighbors, of defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and most ludicrously, costing her valuable future leadership opportunities. She demanded a staggering sum, $250,000. She claimed her reputation had been unfairly ruined, that the videos and evidence presented at the hearing and shared online were maliciously edited to slander her, and that Daniel had orchestrated an elaborate campaign solely to destroy her life. The case was accepted and entered the county civil court system. And once again, Daniel found himself heading to court. This time, not as the complainant, but as a key witness for the legal team representing the Whispering Pines community. Because this time, Eleanor wasn't facing one family. She was facing everyone, the once silent neighbors now united. The trial lasted 4 tense days. Day 1, Eleanor's lawyer, she'd wisely hired one this time, tried to paint a picture of a dedicated woman, a model community leader victimized by an online mob fueled by misinformation and personal vendettas. Day 2 was the HOA's legal team's counteroffensive. Backed by testimony from over 30 Whispering Pines residents, they systematically presented, yet again, the entire body of evidence detailing Eleanor's abuse of power, the illicit HOA fund checks bearing her signature, the clearly forged proxy ballots, the illegal placement of surveillance cameras targeting our home, proof of HOA funds used for personal gain, including a $600 invoice for a gold-plated, presidential nameplate, and of course, the infamous bird feeder email, which had somehow leaked online and become a local meme. Day 3 was Daniel's testimony. He took the stand, maintaining his calm demeanor, no bitterness or anger in his voice. He told the story from his perspective, explaining how he'd volunteered to serve his country overseas protecting freedoms, only to return home and find a power-obsessed neighbor systematically stripping away those same basic freedoms with forms, fines, and the false authority granted by an HOA title. He ended his testimony with a simple but powerful statement that silenced the courtroom. "Your Honor, I didn't fight for this country so that when I came back, a woman with a clipboard could arbitrarily tell my mother what color garden hose she's allowed to use, or so my sister, an active-duty soldier, could be illegally detained on her way home from duty." A hush fell over the room. Even the judge paused, visibly affected by the genuine and potent words. Day 4, the judge delivered the final verdict. There was no hesitation. Eleanor's lawsuit was dismissed entirely with prejudice, meaning she could never refile the same claim again. But that wasn't all. The court ordered Eleanor to pay the entirety of the Whispering Pines HOA's legal fees, totaling $18,400, a figure eerily matching the amount she had embezzled from the HOA funds as her self-paid stipend over 3 years. Her bank account was frozen to ensure payment. Whispering Pines had officially won. It had successfully been Eleanor proofed. With the specter of Eleanor finally banished, Whispering Pines didn't just recover. It thrived. A new, strictly interim and volunteer-based HOA board was formed, comprised of neighbors who actually cared about the community, people who wanted to live there, not rule it. They threw a massive block party in the Central Park, the first genuine community gathering in years free from fear and suspicion. Children's laughter echoed through the streets again as they rode bikes freely. Dogs barked happily without fear of citation. And most importantly, garden gnomes returned triumphantly to lawns, including the Miller's infamous Garth Brooks gnome. Daniel was again asked to join the new board, but he politely declined, saying he preferred peace behind the scenes. At the block party, however, someone presented him with a beautifully crafted wooden sign that read, "Whispering Pines Watchdog's Neighborhood Hero." He laughed, accepted it, and hung it proudly on our porch, right next to the American flag. Even Buddy, our old golden retriever, seemed to walk with a lighter, happier step. As for our family? We installed a second flagpole right beside the American one. On it, the P.O.W/M.I.A. flag flies solemnly, a reminder of sacrifice and the values we hold dear. Regarding Eleanor, rumor has it she attempted to move into a posh gated community in Florida but was rejected during the interview process. Apparently, someone on their board Googled her name and easily found the HOA hearing footage, the court judgment, and yes, even the bird feeder memes. Word is, she now lives quietly somewhere far away, hopefully clipboard-free. A few weeks later, when things had truly settled, I was taking an evening stroll through the neighborhood with Daniel and Sarah, home on leave. No drama, no tension, just the warm glow of sunset, the buzz of cicadas, and the occasional tick-tick-tick of sprinklers kicking on. We passed the lawn where Gary had drawn his gun on Daniel. It had now been converted into a small community herb garden, fragrant with rosemary and mint. We waved at the Devises grilling in their backyard. Mrs. Peterson sat on her porch, gently rocking with her cat. As we passed the old oak tree by our house, Daniel stopped, looked up at the bird feeder still hanging there, attracting a few late diners, then turned to me. "Funny how peace feels louder than chaos, Mom," he said quietly. I nodded. "Especially peace you had to fight for, son." He smiled, a genuinely relaxed smile. "Let's keep it that way." There's a strange kind of peace that settles in after the ridiculous war waged by a clipboard finally ends. The feeling when you can finally sit on your own porch without wondering if the color of your throw pillow violates some obscure bylaw about beige undertones. Where bird feeders can swing freely, garden gnomes can stand proud, and the only thing arriving in your mailbox are junk mail flyers, not fines. But even now, as the sun sets over a quieter, much happier Whispering Pines, I can't stop thinking about that time. I think about how close we came, as a community, to letting one person, just one person with an obsession for control, turn our neighborhood into a place ruled by fear and suspicion. And I think about the hard lessons we learned. Because this story isn't just about Eleanor and her abuse of power. It's about what happens when we stop paying attention, when we assume the person holding the clipboard and the title always has the community's best interests at heart. It's about the price of apathy. Power fills a vacuum. Eleanor didn't just seize control of the HOA. We inadvertently not showing up to meetings, by not voting, by rolling our eyes at seemingly harmless initial rules and thinking, "It's minor, who cares?" Well, Eleanor cared. And that's exactly how she turned simple lawn care guidelines into draconian law. If your neighborhood has an HOA, or is considering one, get involved. Understand your bylaws. Read the meeting minutes. Ask who signs the checks for the community funds. Because bad rules don't happen overnight. They creep in silently when no one is watching. Petty tyrants can't win if you document everything. Daniel didn't use force or shouting. He created a paper trail, an undeniable record. Every photo of Eleanor's own violations, every threatening email, every shady ballot was carefully logged, printed, timestamped. When it came time for the showdown, it wasn't his word against hers. It was hard evidence against her flimsy narrative. So if you're dealing with your own little despot in khakis, start your own record-keeping now. Because the only thing heavier than their loud voice is their own actions, documented on paper. Community strength always trumps autocratic control. The ultimate reason Eleanor fell wasn't just one person's effort. It was because the community woke up. The DeVises, the Millers, sweet Mrs. Peterson, and so many others. People who had been silent for too long finally said, "Enough!" together. And once neighbors start talking, sharing information, and uniting, the tyrant's walls of power start to crumble. So, build bridges in your community before you need them. Have those block parties. Talk to the person 2 doors down. Share garden tools, gossip, or just a cup of coffee. Because organized neighbors are Eleanor's worst nightmare. Justice might be slow, but it does grind on. Honestly, there were times we felt Eleanor was untouchable, that she'd never face consequences. And maybe you're reading this thinking, my neighborhood has an Eleanor, and nothing ever happens to her. But trust me, time, evidence, and the legal system, however slowly they might move, eventually catch up. It's not always fast, it's not always loud, but when justice lands, it lands hard. Now it's your turn. We want to hear your HOA story. I've told my families. Now we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let us know, have you ever dealt with an Eleanor or a Gary in your neighborhood? What's the most ridiculous HOA rule you've ever encountered? Or maybe you've served on an HOA board and tried to clean up a predecessor's mess? We read every story. And who knows, your own HOA horror story might be the next one we share. So, don't be shy, share it. Let's build a community of people who understand the fine line between reasonable rule enforcement and pathological ego enforcement. And if this story made you laugh, cringe, or feel a little vindicated watching Eleanor's downfall, hit that like button, share it with your neighbors, and subscribe for more unbelievable, but true, HOA tales you won't believe actually happened. Wasn't that story about Whispering Pines, Eleanor, and the fight for peace intense? From Gary pointing a gun at Daniel over a bird feeder, to Sarah's steely confrontation, and the final takedown of a tyrannical HOA regime, we saw the power of persistence and community. But do you think HOA nightmares stop there? Oh no. If you thought Eleanor and Gary would peak absurdity, get ready for the story coming up right now on our channel. Picture this, a peaceful Saturday afternoon, you've just assembled your brand new barbecue grill, ready for a cookout, when lifetime HOA President Brenda Jenkins and her self-appointed security enforcer Dennis show up, declaring your grill illegal and demanding its immediate removal. Little do they know, the homeowner they're confronting is Michael, a cool-headed Special Forces veteran who knows more about the law than they know about their own ridiculous rules. What happens when an HOA dictator clashes with a soldier trained to handle threats? What unexpected spice gets added to that barbecue? Don't go anywhere. The story of the Oak Haven barbecue beatdown is coming up next. Keep listening to find out. Dennis, the HOA's self-proclaimed security, was standing in my backyard, jabbing a finger at my husband Michael's brand new barbecue grill. "This has gotta go," he growled. Behind him, Brenda Jenkins, Oak Haven's HOA president for life, stood with her arms crossed, that familiar smug grin plastered on her face. They ruled our quiet neighborhood like their personal fiefdom, a place where paint color regulations mattered more than basic kindness. They thought they held all the power, right up until the day they decided to mess with the wrong former Special Forces veteran. What Brenda and her crony didn't know was that Michael wasn't just the quiet guy who enjoyed gardening. He was trained to handle threats, unnervingly calm, and knew his rights far better than they knew their petty bylaws. What happened next? Let's just say the barbecue that day got a little extra, unexpected spice. I'm Sarah. My husband, Michael, and I chose Oak Haven 3 years ago as the place we finally settled down and enjoy our later years. After Michael's long career in the military, we craved genuine peace and quiet, seeking refuge on streets shaded by mature oak trees in a neighborhood that promised suburban tranquility. Oak Haven, with its lawns manicured like green carpets and its houses displaying a surprising architectural uniformity, initially seemed picture-perfect, an ideal spot to leisurely sip our morning coffee and listen to the birds sing. But that serene facade hid a different reality, a reality named Brenda Jenkins. No one, not in the initial friendly greetings or the glossy neighborhood brochures, warned us about her. Brenda had confidently taken the seat of HOA president in an election where she ran unopposed. Looking back, that was the community's first fatal mistake. Apathy handed power to someone who shouldn't have wielded it. At first, things seemed fairly standard for an HOA. Brenda appeared quite proactive with colorful community newsletters and gentle reminders about bringing in trash cans promptly after pickup day or decorating homes for holidays. We, like many others, probably thought she was just enthusiastic about community matters, perhaps a bit rigid but ultimately harmless. But power, even the power to dictate fence colors or mailbox heights, has a potent allure. It was like a drug that slowly took hold of Brenda. She began reviewing old bylaws, then started writing new clauses herself, transforming the community handbook into a draconian set of rules designed to serve her personal whims and consolidate her power. Oak Haven gradually became the personal stage for her power play. Brenda embodied the type of neighbor you only dare to peek at through the blinds, the kind who could measure the height of your grass blades with a judgmental gaze and believed even the color of your porch flower pots needed to adhere to some vaguely defined, approved color palette. She likely invented herself. The first time we truly felt her special attention was when we found a $50 fine notice neatly tucked onto our door. The reason? Our mailbox was allegedly half an inch higher than stipulated in Section 3, Article 4. Michael and I laughed out loud, finding the pettiness unbelievable. We figured she either had too much time on her hands or was just flexing her authority a bit ridiculously. But the laughter died just a week later. This time, the target was my bright green garden hose, which I cherished. It was fined for disrupting the overall visual harmony of the residential area, under Section 7B. The ridiculous part? I was using it to save my beloved rose bushes from the scorching 95-degree Fahrenheit heat. Clearly, this was no longer about boredom or overzealousness. Brenda Jenkins had power, albeit petty power, and she knew how to use it like a blunt instrument to impose her will on others. She wasn't just a neighbor anymore. She was running a miniature regime, and we started to realize the peace in Oak Haven was merely an illusion. Things started going downhill faster when Brenda recruited Dennis. He wasn't even a resident of Oak Haven, but as the HOA president's boyfriend, he was suddenly bestowed with the unofficial yet intimidating title, Head of Community Security. No one voted for this position, there was no appointment process, but that didn't stop Dennis from donning a cheap navy blue windbreaker with HOA Security clumsily self-printed on the back. With a perpetual scowl and a chest-puffed-out swagger, as if he were patrolling a war zone instead of a quiet residential street, Dennis became an annoyingly familiar sight. He'd cruise the streets in his beat-up pickup truck at odd hours, clutching a notebook and a digital camera, scrutinizing every minor detail. He'd knock on people's doors unannounced, citing vague or newly invented HOA clauses to issue warnings or threaten fines. The atmosphere in Oak Haven began to change. The underlying neighborly friendliness slowly gave way to a simmering anxiety. Some residents, especially the elderly or those who just didn't want trouble, hastily complied with Dennis's every unreasonable demand, whether it was repainting window trim or moving a potted plant. Others simply chose to avoid him, ducking inside when they saw his truck approaching or pretending not to hear his knock. Michael, with his calm nature and experience handling far more stressful situations, initially just observed. He shook his head at Dennis's ridiculous antics and Brenda's growing tyranny but didn't intervene directly. However, it seemed Michael's very calmness, his refusal to show any fear, made us a particular target for the power couple. Perhaps they expected submission, or at least anxiety, and not getting it from Michael irritated them. The first direct attack targeted his trusty Ford F-150 pickup. During an HOA meeting we didn't attend, but were informed about by a kind neighbor, Brenda grandly declared Michael's truck oversized according to the community's general aesthetic standards. She even went so far as to comment that its all-terrain tires looked too aggressive and unsuitable for the family atmosphere. The result was a $150 fine notice delivered to our house. What worried me wasn't the fine itself, but Michael's reaction. He quietly looked at the notice, pulled out his wallet, and paid it online immediately, without a single word of complaint or argument. That silence, that almost detached calm, was always a sign of a storm brewing quietly inside him. Shortly after the truck incident, Brenda struck another blow. She convened an emergency meeting, attended only by herself and a few loyalists, and passed an emergency amendment to the landscaping rules. This new rule prohibited the use of unnaturally colored organic ground cover, directly targeting the reddish-brown pine bark mulch we had just spent considerable time and money installing across our front yard the week before, a choice that had been perfectly legal under the old rules. Another fine notice arrived, this time for $300, demanding we remove the mulch within 10 days. It was around then that I started noticing Michael spending more time in his small home office. He'd spread the thick HOA rulebook out on his desk, alongside printouts of state laws and county ordinances regarding property rights and the limits of HOA authority. He highlighted sections with a marker, scribbled copious notes in the margins, and compared different versions of the bylaws he had cleverly obtained from previous neighbors. He was quietly building an arsenal of information. But the final straw came from an unexpected target, Charlie, our gentle, 10-year-old golden retriever. One afternoon, Charlie was playing in our securely fenced backyard when he spotted a squirrel stealing from the bird feeder. He let out a few warning barks, nothing more. Yet that very evening, we received an official email from Brenda, subject line: complaint regarding excessive noise and animal aggression. The email accused Charlie of disturbing the public peace and threatening the safety of local wildlife. The last part truly made my blood boil. This constitutes a final warning. Should this behavior recur, we will be obligated to report the matter to County Animal Control for appropriate action. I turned to look at Michael. For the first time since this HOA battle began, I saw clear emotion on his face. His jaw tightened, and his eyes narrowed with a cold glint I rarely saw. He'd faced dangerous enemies, witnessed terrible things, but threatening the safety of a family member, even our sweet old dog, had crossed the final line. He said nothing for a few seconds, just stared at the computer screen. Then he turned to me, his voice steady but laced with steely determination. "Okay, Sarah," he said. "I'll handle this." Michael's way of handling it, after the Charlie incident, wasn't a loud confrontation or harsh words. That wasn't his style. Instead, he applied the very skills honed over years in special operations: patience, meticulous observation, and systematic intelligence gathering. His quiet campaign began immediately. His compact digital camera became his constant companion on walks around the neighborhood. Brenda's own fence, a solid brick structure, clearly feet taller than the limit specified in the very bylaws she constantly cited. Michael took photos from multiple angles, carefully noting dates and times. Dennis's old truck routinely parked illegally overnight on the common HOA road, taking up space and violating the same parking rules he enforced on others. Michael shot short videos as evidence. He didn't stop there. Michael started scrutinizing the sparse quarterly financial reports the HOA released. He noticed murky expenditures listed under management expenses and travel allowances attributed to Brenda, with steadily increasing amounts. He drafted a formal request, citing his rights as an HOA member, asking to review the detailed accounting ledgers and related invoices. Predictably, his request was flatly denied by Brenda under the guise of financial confidentiality, which only fueled Michael's suspicions about the lack of transparency and potential misappropriation of community funds. Parallel to gathering evidence of Brenda's and Dennis's misconduct, Michael began a different, more delicate mission: connecting with the neighbors. He didn't directly complain about his own family's troubles but simply struck up conversations and listened. He talked to Mr. Garcia, recently hit with a hefty fine because his cobalt blue front door paint was deemed inappropriate. He chatted with Mrs. Miller, who received a warning letter because her son's plastic toys were left in the yard past 7 p.m., a curfew that never existed in the bylaws. He checked in on poor Mrs. Petrov, a gentle widow fined because her geraniums were allegedly too vibrant and distracting to drivers. What Michael discovered was staggering. Simmering discontent was widespread throughout Oak Haven. So many people had suffered Brenda and Dennis's arbitrary harshness in silence. And crucially, Michael wasn't the only one quietly documenting evidence. Mr. Garcia had saved all his email correspondence with Brenda. Mrs. Miller had a phone recording of Dennis's threatening tone when he visited her home. Mrs. Petrov, despite her age, had carefully kept all the absurd fine notices she'd received. Michael meticulously collected this evidence, made copies, and organized it methodically into an ever-thickening dossier. Each story, each piece of proof, was clearly annotated, creating a comprehensive picture of systematic abuse of power. He hadn't brought the dossier to light yet, hadn't filed any formal complaints with the county or state. He was waiting. As he told me one evening while organizing the papers, "You know, Sarah, the best way to deal with a bully isn't to shout louder than them. It's to prepare thoroughly, wait for the right moment, and then use their own rules, the very regulations they hide behind, to expose them." That dossier sat in his desk drawer like a ticking time bomb, patiently counting down. The moment Michael had been waiting for finally arrived, not in a tense meeting or via a complaint letter, but on a sun-drenched Saturday afternoon. He had just finished assembling a gleaming stainless steel barbecue grill, a gift to himself for anticipated relaxing summer evenings on our cozy little backyard patio. The grill stood proudly on the paving stones, ready for its inaugural cookout. But before the scent of charcoal could even begin to waft through the air, Brenda and Dennis appeared at the back gate, Brenda's face a cold mask, Dennis scowling as usual. Without a word of greeting, Dennis marched straight over to the brand new grill and rudely pointed at it. "This violates Section 12, Appendix C of the HOA bylaws," he declared, his tone full of faux authority. "All outdoor cooking appliances require prior written approval. You need to remove it immediately, or you'll face a hefty fine." Michael, who had been calmly wiping down his grilling tools, slowly looked up, his eyes showing no hint of confusion. He wiped his hands on the apron he was wearing, then looked directly at Dennis. "Is that so, Dennis? What a coincidence. I just reread Section 12 this morning," he said, his voice so calm it was almost casual. "That clause the bylaws provided to residents." Seeing Dennis seem flustered, Brenda quickly jumped in, her voice shrill. "The bylaws were updated by the board. Haven't you kept up?" Michael turned to her, his tone still polite but firm. "Then perhaps Madam President could provide me with a copy of that updated version, complete with the date of enactment and proof of approval by a majority of the board, according to proper legal procedure?" Michael's articulate and confident response clearly rattled Dennis. He took a step forward, deliberately puffing his chest in an attempt to intimidate, and in a calculated move, casually lifted his security jacket just enough to reveal the handgun holstered at his side. It was a blatant act of intimidation, a wordless warning. But if he expected Michael to flinch or back down, he was sorely mistaken. Michael didn't even blink. His gaze turned ice-cold, locking onto Dennis's eyes. "Dennis," he said, his voice still calm but now carrying a dangerous weight. "Carrying a firearm while performing these self-appointed HOA duties, especially when there's no apparent threat, could very well constitute felony menacing under state law. More importantly, you're not a licensed law enforcement officer, yet you're deliberately acting and using insignia as if you possess that authority. That's a very serious legal matter. Would you like us to discuss Section 18 of the State Penal Code, regarding impersonating a public servant?" The sharp words, the precise legal citations, and Michael's absolute confidence hit Dennis like a bucket of cold water. He froze, his face straining of color. He shot Brenda a helpless look, but she was just standing there, mouth agape in astonishment, speechless. Silence hung over the backyard for a few tense seconds. Finally, Michael broke it, his voice softening slightly but remaining firm. "This grill stays. If you and Madam President still believe there's a violation, please follow the proper procedure. Send a formal written notice, citing the specific, validly approved bylaw being violated, and we will address it legally. Now I wish you both a good afternoon." The initial arrogance gone, Dennis, flushed with embarrassment and anger, didn't dare utter another word. He spun around and practically fled from our backyard. Brenda shot us a venomous glare but then stomped off after him. Watching from the window, my heart was still pounding from the tension, but a wave of pride and relief washed over me. The barbecue showdown, though perhaps just beginning, saw round one clearly go to us. The fiery confrontation by the barbecue grill wasn't just an argument over HOA rules. It became the spark that ignited the long-simmering flames of discontent in Oak Haven. The story of how Michael, the quiet veteran, calmly faced down and schooled the arrogant security enforcer Dennis spread like wildfire through whispered conversations over fences, private messages, and discreet phone calls. The incident acted like a catalyst for bravery. Neighbors who had previously suffered in silence, or only complained behind Brenda and Dennis's backs, started speaking up more boldly. They shared their stories of unreasonable fines, intimidation, and unfair treatment more openly. The wall of fear Brenda had painstakingly built began to crack. Feeling publicly humiliated and seeing her absolute power seriously threatened, Brenda Jenkins reacted the only way tyrants typically do when challenged, escalating retaliation. She couldn't stand being defied by a resident, especially with the whole neighborhood implicitly watching. That very evening, an email with the sensational subject line, "Urgent Community Security Alert," landed in the inboxes of every household in Oak Haven. The email's content was a furious indictment aimed squarely at our family. Brenda accused us of Systematic defiance, deliberately undermining efforts to maintain community order and aesthetics, and even insinuated that our new barbecue grill posed a potential fire hazard, threatening the entire neighborhood's safety. It was a desperate attempt to save face and slander us before the community. But in her anger and blindness fueled by challenged authority, Brenda made a fatal mistake. Perhaps wanting to project an image of fearlessness and legal backing, even if fictitious, or maybe just a catastrophic slip-up, she hit CC, carbon copy, on that email to an address she didn't recognize, the official email address of the law firm Michael had retained just days earlier. It belonged to a top expert in real estate law and HOA disputes, whom Michael had quietly consulted after the incident involving our dog, Charlie. The response from Michael's lawyer was swift. The very next morning, a sharply worded legal letter, a cease and desist, was delivered directly to Brenda. It demanded she immediately stop all defamatory and libelous actions against our family, and warned of severe legal consequences should she continue. Simultaneously, Michael decided the time was right to unleash the secret weapon he had so carefully prepared. He and his lawyer formally filed a detailed complaint with the County HOA Oversight Board, the agency responsible for supervising neighborhood HOAs like Oak Haven's. The complaint didn't just outline the harassment and baseless fines our family had endured, it attached the entire dossier of evidence Michael had compiled, photos of Brenda's own fence violating the height restrictions she enforced on others, videos of Dennis parking illegally and exhibiting intimidating behavior, copies of numerous nonsensical fines issued not just to us but to many other neighbors, along with their written testimonies. But the most damning blow was the financial analysis, presenting evidence that Brenda had authorized over $18,000 in HOA funds to herself over 2 years under vague categories like personal management costs and travel allowances, all without proper approval from any documented board meeting. A special hearing of the County HOA Oversight Board was quickly convened to review the complaint. Brenda Jenkins arrived, trying to maintain her usual air of confidence and authority, dressed in professional business attire. However, Dennis was conspicuously absent. He likely smelled legal trouble and decided to keep his distance. She attempted to defend herself, blaming unfortunate misunderstandings, dismissing it as personal conflicts, and accusing us and a few difficult residents of deliberately causing trouble. But as Michael's lawyer began to systematically and clearly present each piece of evidence, the unambiguous figures on HOA bank statements, the clear photographic evidence of Brenda's own rule violations, the audio recordings of Dennis's threatening voice, the consistent testimonies from multiple residents, Brenda's facade crumbled. Her face paled, and her hands began to tremble. She stammered rebuttals, but her words became disjointed and unconvincing against the weight of the evidence. After a thorough review of the entire file and listening to all parties, the County Oversight Board didn't take long to reach a decision. They voted unanimously to remove Brenda Jenkins from all positions on the Oak Haven HOA Board, effective immediately. Furthermore, they ordered a full, independent financial audit of the Oak Haven HOA covering Brenda's entire tenure. More seriously, the entire file concerning the suspicious expenditures and potential embezzlement was formally referred to the county prosecutor's office for a criminal investigation. Justice, though slow, had finally begun to speak. Even after being removed from office and facing potential criminal charges, Brenda Jenkins's competitive and arrogant nature didn't diminish. She couldn't accept the reality that her tyrannical reign over Oak Haven had ended in disgrace. Instead of quietly retreating, Brenda decided to launch one last desperate attack, a civil lawsuit. She filed suit against Michael, the Garcias, the Millers, and even poor Mrs. Petrov, accusing all of us of conspiracy to defame, intentional infliction of severe emotional distress, and demanding substantial damages for the alleged harm to her reputation and career opportunities. It was a desperate act, a final vindictive attempt to punish those who dared to stand up to her. However, the lawsuit only further exposed Brenda's absurdity and spitefulness. At the preliminary hearing, our lawyer, whose fees were graciously supported by contributions from relieved neighbors, easily presented evidence showing Brenda's claims were entirely baseless. The emails, the fines, the testimonies used in the previous hearing were brought forth again, demonstrating that Brenda's own actions were the source of all the trouble. The judge, after a quick review, swiftly dismissed Brenda's lawsuit with prejudice, meaning she couldn't refile the same baseless claims again. Not only that, but the court also ordered Brenda to pay all our associated legal costs. Facing humiliating legal defeat, the looming criminal investigation, and mounting financial pressure, Brenda was finally forced to accept reality. She quietly put her house up for sale and vanished from the neighborhood almost overnight. Some said she moved to Florida, others heard Arizona, but no one knew for sure. Her fate became a cautionary tale in Oak Haven about the inevitable downfall of abused power. As for Dennis, he disappeared without a trace right after the county board hearing, as if he'd never existed. The departure of Brenda and Dennis felt like lifting a dark, oppressive cloud that had hung over Oak Haven for too long. The atmosphere in the neighborhood changed almost instantly. A palpable sense of relief and freedom spread. An interim HOA board was quickly formed, comprised of volunteers who actually lived in and cared about the community, neighbors we knew and trusted. Their first order of business was to review the entire thick HOA rulebook Brenda had left behind. Scores of absurd, petty, and personally motivated rules were unanimously abolished. The strict rule on garden hose color? Gone. The pointless limit on pickup truck size parked in driveways? Eliminated. The complicated approval process for placing a portable barbecue grill in one's own backyard? Scrapped, of course. Oak Haven felt reborn. Children's laughter echoed on the streets again in the afternoons. Spontaneous neighborhood barbecues became more frequent, strengthening community bonds. Mr. Garcia proudly repainted his front door in the vibrant cobalt blue he loved. Mrs. Petrov happily planted even more geraniums of all bright colors on her porch without fear of being fined. Michael, given his pivotal role in overthrowing the old regime, was nominated by many to join the new board. But he politely declined. "I did my part," he said. "Now I just want some quiet, to enjoy the peace we fought so hard to get back." His contribution wasn't forgotten, however. At a large community potluck held in the Central Park to celebrate Oak Haven's new era, a neighbor unexpectedly presented him with a new grilling apron. Printed on it was the humorous inscription, "Barbecue King and Oak Haven Defender." Michael laughed out loud but accepted it graciously and wore it for the rest of the party. Even Charlie seemed to sense the change. Our old dog could now freely chase squirrels in the yard without causing us worry about warning letters. Our stainless steel barbecue grill still stands proudly in the corner of the patio, not just a source of delicious food but a silent symbol of change, of the triumph of reason and persistence. Occasionally, on weekend afternoons, while standing by the grill flipping burgers, Michael will turn to me with a knowing glint in his eye. "See, Sarah," he'll say. "Sometimes the best way to fight fire isn't with more fire, but with a cool head." The tough battle with the Oak Haven Homeowners Association finally ended, restoring the precious peace we should have had all along. But its aftermath left more than just relief. It left profound lessons, unforgettable reminders of how a seemingly ideal community can quickly become a suffocating place under the rule of an individual abusing power, simply because of initial apathy and the widespread "it's no big deal" mentality. We almost let Brenda Jenkins turn our own homes into invisible prisons ruled by absurd regulations. The first, and perhaps most crucial lesson: never underestimate the power, however small it seems, of a homeowners association. Many of us tend to skip HOA meetings, don't bother reading the complex bylaws, or pay little attention to who holds the power and spends community funds. It's precisely that silence and lack of participation that creates the fertile power vacuum, allowing people like Brenda to easily climb up, manipulate the system, and impose their personal whims on an entire community. Get involved. Speak up. Know the rules that govern your life in your own home. The second lesson is the undeniable power of documentation. Michael won this fight not through loud arguments or force, but through meticulous preparation and irrefutable evidence. Every email exchange, every photo of a violation, every note about a conversation, every unreasonable fine notice, he carefully saved and methodically organized them all. When facing a petty tyrant like Brenda or an arrogant enforcer like Dennis, your paper trail is your strongest weapon. It transforms complaints into evidence and turns arbitrary actions into provable misconduct. Never delete emails, don't throw away notices, document everything. The third lesson is the strength of community solidarity. Brenda could only run rampant, while neighbors lived in fear and suspicion of one another. She ruled by dividing. But the moment people started openly sharing their stories, pooling their evidence, and standing together for what was right, her seemingly impenetrable wall of power crumbled quickly. Get to know the people living around you. Build trust and good relationships. A united community is the worst nightmare for any abuser of power. And finally, the fourth lesson is to have faith in justice, even when it seems slow or distant. The fight can be long, frustrating, and costly. There will be times you feel discouraged, tempted to give up in the face of stubbornness and dirty tricks. But the story of Oak Haven proves that persistently gathering evidence, adhering to proper legal procedures, and relentlessly fighting for what's right will eventually yield results. Justice may grind slowly, but it will prevail. Now, we want to hear your story. Have you ever faced a similar HOA nightmare? Are there rules about BBQs, fence colors, or even the types of plants in your garden that make you shake your head in disbelief at their absurdity? Share your experiences, your struggles, and your triumphs, if any, in the comments section below. Let's build a space where neighbors can learn from and support each other, affirming that communities are meant for harmonious living, not for a few individuals to impose unreasonable control. If the story of the Oak Haven barbecue showdown made you nod along in sympathy, chuckle at the irony, or feel a bit of satisfaction when justice was served, please give us a thumbs up, share this story with your neighbors. Maybe they need a little encouragement too. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more true stories about HOA battles, frustrating yet meaningful situations concerning the right to enjoy your own home and community. Wow, quite a journey in Oak Haven, wasn't it, folks? So satisfying to see Brenda and Dennis finally face the consequences of their power trip, and Michael proving that calm preparation truly is the best weapon. Peace returned to that neighborhood, and the barbecue grill became a symbol of victory for what's right. But wait! Don't touch that dial or click away just yet. Because if you think HOA nightmares stop there, you'd be mistaken. Self-appointed power and bullies always seem to find a way to creep into even the quietest neighborhoods. Right now, we're diving into another story, this time in a neighborhood called Serene Oaks. There, another HOA enforcer, a guy named Rick, who's even armed himself like he's actual law enforcement, is getting ready to school a resident for daring to make some noise. But he's about to make a huge mistake. He's about to knock on the wrong door. And the quiet man who answers that door, Alex, happens to be the last person any bully wants to confront. What happens when HOA arrogance meets grit forged in the toughest environments? Will Rick realize who he's dealing with before it's too late? Keep listening right now to discover this tense and surprising confrontation. You definitely don't want to miss it. Hammering shattered the afternoon quiet. It was the kind of brutal, entitled pounding Rick, the HOA president's muscle, favored. He stood there scowling, hand hovering near the holstered gun at his hip, ready to educate anyone daring to make noise. He was here to impose order. But the door swung open, and the man facing him wasn't who he expected. It was Alex, tall, silent, eyes sharp, assessing the situation. Alex's deadly calm and ready stance made Rick's aggression evaporate, replaced by a chilling unease. He froze, realizing he'd made a catastrophic mistake knocking on this door. The man he'd intended to intimidate was dealt a force. "My name is Sarah. When my husband, Mark, and I decided to retire, we dreamed of a peaceful sanctuary, a quiet corner away from the world's noise." Serene Oaks seemed to be that dream made real. With its streets shaded by ancient oaks and charming houses nestled behind meticulously trimmed white picket fences, the neighborhood promised the very tranquility we craved. We pictured leisurely mornings sipping coffee on the porch, afternoons tending rose bushes, and a slow, comfortable life after decades of relentless work. The scene was perfect, almost too good to be true. And indeed, beneath the serene facade lay a reality we hadn't anticipated. The quiet wasn't natural, but imposed by an invisible iron fist cloaked in the velvet glove of the Homeowners Association, the HOA. The one wielding that power was Brenda. At first glance, Brenda seemed harmless enough. A widow, seemingly lonely, who offered friendly smiles at the rare HOA meetings hardly anyone bothered to attend. Community apathy had landed her the presidency. No one else wanted the tedious paperwork. That was the initial mistake, a collective lapse whose consequences we would only later understand. Initially, Brenda handled typical HOA tasks, the small things everyone found reasonable, gentle reminders about putting trash cans out a few hours too early, or suggestions about the recommended paint colors in the neighborhood's slim rulebook. Like many neighbors, Mark and I just chuckled, figuring she had too much time on her hands or was perhaps just overzealous in her new role. We were wrong. Power, however small, is intoxicating, and Brenda quickly became drunk on it. Her initial enthusiasm morphed into an obsession with control. The HOA's slim rulebook began to mysteriously thicken, filled with increasingly detailed and bizarre bylaws penned by Brenda herself. The once friendly reminders were replaced by rigid fine notices delivered straight to our mailboxes. $50 because a potted plant was deemed an aesthetically incorrect placement, disrupting a harmony only Brenda could perceive. $100 because a seasonal decorative flag was deemed out of character with the community spirit. Even before the holiday was over, Brenda began conducting personal patrols around the neighborhood, armed with a tape measure and a camera, documenting every minor, often unintentional, infraction. The Miller's whimsical garden gnomes, which brought smiles to the local children, were suddenly labeled a serious aesthetic detriment. The Devise's vibrant blue patio umbrella was cited for being too garish, affecting the subdued landscape. Then Rick appeared, like a hulking shadow reinforcing Brenda's authority. He was her new boyfriend, a large, rough-looking man who seemed perpetually unemployed. Without election or official appointment, Rick suddenly became Serene Oak's self-appointed head of security. He drove his noisy, beat-up pickup truck around the neighborhood at random hours, eyes scrutinizing every yard, every window. He wouldn't hesitate to bang on doors with an officious, condescending attitude to remind or enforce regulations, clearly relishing his irregularly delegated authority. Some older neighbors seemed intimidated by him, avoiding his gaze. Others, like us, initially chose to ignore him, hoping his bullying was temporary, that he'd eventually get bored. Mark and I tried our best to stay out of trouble. We strictly adhered to the lawn mowing schedule, repainted our mailbox to match the exact paint code Brenda had just updated, and even had to put away my favorite green garden hose after receiving a $75 fine because it disrupted the neighborhood's approved neutral color palette. All we wanted was the peace we had moved here to find. But that peace felt increasingly fragile and costly. Finding fault seemed to have become Brenda and Rick's raison d'etre. They held HOA meetings attended almost exclusively by themselves and a few cronies, easily passing ever more restrictive rules without genuine majority consent. Serene Oaks was no longer a community. It was becoming a petty dictatorship, where fear of absurd fines and constant harassment served as instruments of control. The atmosphere in Serene Oaks grew increasingly oppressive under the management of Brenda and her enforcer, Rick. Their control extended beyond mere aesthetic rules about paint colors or grass height. Now they meddled in more personal aspects of daily life, turning every normal activity into a potential violation. The Petersons, a quiet young family, received a fine because their 10-year-old son was playing basketball in his own driveway on a sunny afternoon. The stated reason was excessive noise violation, though the only sounds were the rhythmic bounce of the ball and the child's occasional giggle. Mrs. Gable, a respected widow in her 80s who took immense pride in her rose garden, suddenly received a stern warning letter. Her crime? Planting a rose variety not on the pre-approved flora list, a list no one had ever seen or heard of before. It seemed everything, from a child's laughter to the color of a flower, could become a pretext for Brenda and Rick to flex their authority, asserting absolute power over their little kingdom. A suffocating tension crept into every corner, making many feel they were living under a harsh surveillance state rather than in a residential community. Amidst this tense atmosphere, my brother, Alex, came to visit. Alex had always been the quiet pride of our family. He was a soldier, serving in a special unit we only knew vaguely about. He never discussed his work, only that it demanded discipline, courage, and extraordinary composure. After a long deployment somewhere remote, all Alex wanted was a quiet leave, a few weeks to rest with family, read, and enjoy the peace he rarely experienced. However, the arrival of a stranger, especially a tall, quiet, and rugged-looking man like Alex, seemed to be a thorn in Brenda and Rick's side. Perhaps the SUV Alex rented for convenience was slightly larger than the typical sedans in the neighborhood, violating some unwritten rule about appropriate vehicle size. Or perhaps, more simply, his presence was an uncontrollable element, an unknown variable in their meticulously ordered world. Whatever the reason, Brenda's scrutiny of our household noticeably increased after Alex arrived. The violation notices became more frequent. A small note tucked in the door informed us that our front lawn had exceeded the mandated height by 0.5 inches and needed immediate trimming. An email complained that Alex's rental car had been parked on the street in front of our house for longer than 2 hours, a rule I'd never heard of before. Petty, trivial matters, yet they arrived constantly, persistently, carrying an undercurrent of malice that left me feeling uneasy and anxious. I began documenting everything: the date the notice was received, the exact wording of the complaint, even the times I spotted Rick's pickup truck suspiciously cruising past my house at odd hours. At the time, I had no specific plan for resistance. The documentation was simply a way to cope with the growing anxiety, a feeling that something ugly was simmering and bound to boil over. And boil over it did, on a beautiful Saturday afternoon. Down the street, the Miller family was hosting a small outdoor birthday party for their 7-year-old son. The atmosphere was cheerful, with soft music playing from a small speaker and the happy shrieks of children playing tag on the lawn. To anyone else, just the normal, pleasant sounds of a weekend afternoon in the suburbs. But to Brenda and Rick, who considered absolute silence the gold standard, it was unacceptable chaos, a blatant violation of community order. No doubt it was Brenda, who else, who picked up the phone and called Rick, her voice likely thick with indignation, complaining about the intolerable noise disrupting the peace. Rick, ever eager for a chance to assert dominance, immediately took the call. He jumped into his clunker truck, its roaring engine shattering the very peace he claimed to protect, and aggressively drove towards the end of the street. However, perhaps blinded by simmering anger, or maybe just out of sheer stupidity, instead of stopping at the Millers at number 12, where the party was, he screeched to a halt in front of my house, number 21. Perhaps he saw Alex's unfamiliar SUV parked at the curb and assumed this must be the source of the disturbance. Without hesitation, he jumped out, stormed up my porch steps, fist raised, ready to pound on the door and unleash his fury on whoever dared disrupt his control. He was here to restore order. What he didn't know was that the order he was about to confront was entirely beyond his comprehension and control. At that moment, I was in the kitchen, holding a hot teapot. Alex was sitting quietly in the living room, absorbed in a book. Suddenly, a knock shattered the quiet, not a polite rap, but heavy, aggressive, intimidating bangs. We both jumped. "I'll get it," I said, starting to put the teapot down. But Alex was already on his feet. His reflexes were lightning fast. He didn't move hastily, but silently, almost soundlessly, towards the door. It wasn't casual curiosity, but ingrained vigilance, an instinct honed by years of facing danger. I only saw his broad, solid back as he reached for the doorknob and smoothly opened the door. Rick stood hulking on the threshold, face flushed with anger, mouth already open to unleash a tirade. He leaned aggressively into the doorway, one hand still hovering near the cheap holster at his hip, a familiar intimidating gesture. "Listen up!" he bellowed, his voice full of swagger. "Got a noise complaint? What the hell are you people doing in there? You know this is a quiet neighborhood with rules, right?" His tone was a mix of self-importance and fury, clearly ready for a confrontation. But the man facing him, Alex, didn't flinch. He stood perfectly still, his silence almost more unnerving than any retort. Though not much taller than Rick, Alex radiated a solidness, an almost tangible focus in his gaze that brought Rick's rant to an abrupt halt. Alex said nothing. He simply looked at Rick. His eyes swept quickly, coolly, from Rick's furious face down to the hand near the weapon, then locked onto Rick's eyes. It wasn't fear or defiance. It was assessment, evaluation, threat analysis, a reflex honed by thousands of hours of intense training in life-or-death situations Rick, in his life of bullying neighbors, could never possibly imagine. In the heavy silence that stretched between them, the air seemed to thicken. Rick, accustomed to using bluster and volume to dominate, suddenly felt small, exposed, strangely vulnerable. He recognized that gaze wasn't from a civilian cowed by his self-important authority. It belonged to someone utterly in control, someone clearly capable of neutralizing him and the threat from that cheap handgun in a fraction of a second. Rick's blustering confidence, his usual armor, evaporated like mist, replaced by a primal, instinctive fear. He suddenly grasped the profound difference between bullying compliant neighbors and facing a trained professional. Rick swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. His hand slowly, almost unconsciously, moved away from the holster. He took a step back, then another, the distance between them feeling like a mile. Well," he stammered, his tone completely changed, all menace gone. Maybe I got the wrong house." He avoided Alex's gaze, unable to meet that terrifying calm anymore. Turning awkwardly, nearly tripping over his own feet, he hurried off my porch, scrambled into his pickup, and sped away, as if fleeing a ghost. Alex stood for another second, his eyes following the retreating truck. Then he turned back inside, gently closing the door. He looked at me, still standing stunned in the living room, and the rarest, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "Guess you really did have the wrong address, sis." Rick's truck may have vanished, but the tremors from the silent confrontation on my porch were just beginning to spread. In a small, tight-knit community like Serene Oaks, where news travels faster than wind, the story of Rick's mistaken, aggressive house call and his sudden deflation before a mysterious stranger quickly became the hot topic. Details were undoubtedly embellished in the retelling. Alex was an undercover agent, a VIP's bodyguard. But the core message remained clear and understood by all. The intimidating facade Rick had carefully constructed had been effortlessly punctured. The fear he'd cultivated suddenly seemed ridiculous. That small incident acted like a match to the dry tinder of long-simmering resident dissatisfaction. The Millers, the actual hosts of the birthday party, felt both angry and relieved. Angry they had nearly suffered Rick's unwarranted wrath, and relieved they had escaped it. The incident emboldened them. The DeVises, weary of the constant complaints about their patio umbrella, started talking more openly with the Petersons, the family fined for their son playing basketball. They shared stories of absurd fines and bizarre rules imposed by Brenda and Rick. Even gentle Mrs. Gable, who had always silently endured the scrutiny over her rose garden, began telling trusted neighbors about the supposed approved rose list no one had ever actually seen. A network of whispers and shared grievances began to form, shattering the silence and isolation Brenda had maintained for so long. That evening, talking with Alex, he asked me a simple question. "Did you document those times they bothered you, sis?" His question was a gentle but powerful reminder. I suddenly remembered the little notebook I'd started keeping. Encouraged by Alex, I decided to share my notes with the few neighbors I trusted. To my surprise, I wasn't alone. It turned out many others had quietly done the same. They had saved fine notices, condescending emails. Some had even discreetly snapped photos of Rick peeking into backyards at inappropriate hours. These individual pieces of evidence began to coalesce, painting a larger picture of systematic abuse of power and harassment. The mounting outrage led to an unprecedented demand, a special HOA meeting called by the residents, not Brenda. For the first time in years, the people of Serene Oaks actively demanded their voices be heard. Brenda, though surprised, tried to control the narrative. She took the floor, launching into her usual speech about the importance of maintaining community values, about the need to follow rules to ensure order. But this time, the atmosphere in the room was completely different. No more reluctant nods or downcast eyes. Instead, there was expectant silence, a palpable tension. Mr. Miller was the first to stand. In a firm voice, he questioned Rick's qualifications and authority. Why was an untrained individual with no official title allowed to act like police, patrolling and intimidating residents? Mrs. Davis followed, asking about the transparency of the fines and how HOA funds were being used. Then it was my turn. Mustering my courage, and perhaps some of the calm I'd absorbed from Alex, I presented the instances of baseless harassment my family had endured, the lack of clarity in the complaint and appeal process. One by one, familiar faces who had long remained silent stood up, sharing their own stories, their pent-up frustrations finally voiced. Brenda was visibly flustered. She tried to interrupt, citing vague clauses in the thick rulebook she herself had authored. But her words now rang hollow. She was utterly alone. Rick, the catalyst for this uprising, hadn't dared to show up at the meeting after his porch encounter shock. The wall of power they had built on fear and authoritarianism had crumbled completely once the community realized the latent power of unity and a shared voice. The outcome was inevitable. A motion for a vote of no confidence in Brenda was proposed and passed swiftly, right then and there. She was removed as HOA president in heavy silence. Rick was ordered to cease his self-appointed security activities immediately and barred from any future HOA involvement. An interim board, composed of motivated resident volunteers, was formed with the urgent task of overhauling the entire system of bylaws and conducting a financial audit of the HOA. The subsequent investigation not only confirmed the suspected abuses of power but also uncovered evidence that Brenda had quietly misappropriated a significant portion of HOA funds for undocumented personal administrative expenses. Justice, though seemingly slow, had finally found its way to Serene Oaks, bringing with it the hope of a fresh start. With the storm of Brenda and Rick having passed, Serene Oaks began to breathe the fresh air of true freedom. The peace that returned wasn't the oppressive silence imposed by fear of nonsensical rules, but a tranquility born from mutual respect and a sense of security. The new HOA board, democratically and transparently elected by the residents themselves, brought a completely different approach. They focused not on control or fault-finding, but on building a genuine community where people felt heard and connected. One of their first actions was to overhaul the thick binder of HOA rules that had become Brenda's instrument of control. Absurd clauses about paint colors, planter placement, permissible flower types, or ridiculous noise limits were scrapped entirely. They were replaced with reasonable guidelines focused on maintaining core shared values like cleanliness, safety, and respect for each other's private spaces. Many of the outstanding fines, arbitrarily issued under Brenda's regime, were largely forgiven, bringing relief to numerous families. Alex, my brother, finished his leave and departed before these significant changes fully took hold. He quietly returned to his clandestine duties, leaving behind a neighborhood in the midst of a powerful resurgence. Alex never claimed to be a hero or intended to interfere in neighborhood affairs. He simply happened to be in the right place at the right time, reacting with the honed instincts of a soldier. Yet, his brief presence and that silent confrontation, achieved without a single word or act of violence, had inadvertently become the powerful catalyst for change. He showed everyone a simple but potent truth: bullies, no matter how aggressive or confident they appear, are often cowards when faced with calm, resolute truth. He had indirectly restored confidence to neighbors who had grown too accustomed to bowing their heads. To celebrate the new beginning, the neighborhood organized a huge barbecue in the community park. It was the first time in years people could gather happily without worrying if their laughter was too loud, if the music playing violated noise ordinances, or if the folding chair they brought was the approved color. The atmosphere was truly different. Laughter and conversation mingled with soft music, children played freely on the green grass. The Millers proudly brought their famous potato salad, something they'd previously hesitated to share for fear of complaints about food smells. The Devises cheerfully showed off their newly purchased vibrant blue patio umbrella, no longer fearing judgmental glares. And amusingly, the whimsical garden gnomes, once deemed an aesthetic detriment, began to reappear proudly on front lawns. Even Buddy, our family's gentle old golden retriever, seemed to sense the shift. He bounded around the yard, tail wagging furiously at everyone. Gone was the cautious anxiety he used to show under Rick's scrutinizing gaze. As for Brenda, her fate became neighborhood lore. After being ousted and facing irrefutable evidence of financial mismanagement, coupled with the community's quiet shunning, she quietly sold her house and moved away. Some said she moved to a sunny southern state, seeking a rental apartment free from HOA oversight. Others heard she went back to live with relatives in another city. No one knew for sure, and frankly, after everything that had happened, it seemed no one really cared much anymore. Brenda's only lasting legacy in Serene Oaks wasn't restrictive rules or perfectly trimmed hedges, but a profound and costly lesson for all who remained about the nature of power, the danger of apathy, and the importance of community voice. Months later, on a golden autumn afternoon, as I sat on my porch sipping warm tea and watching Mark diligently pruning the new rose bushes, I couldn't help but reflect on the turbulent time we'd endured. The peace we now enjoyed tasted different, sweeter, more precious, because we understood how close we'd come to losing it to a petty tyranny disguised as a seemingly harmless community organization like the HOA. The story of Serene Oaks isn't just about an overbearing president and her bullying enforcer. It serves as a vivid illustration of larger lessons anyone living in any organized community should remember. The first, and perhaps most crucial lesson, is that power abhors a vacuum. Brenda didn't naturally acquire absolute control. Our apathy, the community's collective indifference, handed it to her. Skipping meetings, not bothering to vote, avoiding confrontation, thinking, "It's not my problem," all created a power vacuum she easily filled and expanded. Never underestimate the importance of active participation in your community's affairs, no matter how small. Read the bylaws, attend the meetings, ask questions, and vote responsibly. Because apathy is the most fertile ground for authoritarianism and abuse of power to sprout and flourish. The second lesson is the value of documentation. In our confrontation with Brenda and Rick, the meticulous notes and concrete evidence that I and other neighbors had quietly collected became our most potent weapon. Words can be doubted, dismissed, but dated documents, timestamped photos, saved emails are hard to refute. When dealing with those who abuse power, keeping a detailed record of their actions is crucial. It not only strengthens your position but provides solid proof if you need to bring the issue to light or seek external intervention. Make documentation a habit. It's the best preparation for unwelcome situations. The third lesson is the undeniable power of community. Rick might have intimidated individuals with his aggressive demeanor. Brenda might have manipulated meetings and votes for a long time. But neither could stand against the strength of a united community. The moment silent neighbors started talking to each other, sharing grievances and information, the wall of fear Brenda had painstakingly built began to crack and crumble. Unity transforms individual whispers into a powerful chorus that cannot be ignored. So, take the time to know your neighbors, build positive relationships, share information, and support one another. A connected community that listens and helps each other is the strongest defense against any form of tyranny or oppression. And the final lesson is faith in due process and justice. There were times we felt utterly helpless against Brenda and Rick's high-handedness. It seemed they were untouchable, protected by the very rules they created. But ultimately, truth, evidence, and the persistence of those who dared to stand up prevailed. The process of seeking justice can be slow, sometimes difficult and discouraging, but it's not impossible. Never give up fighting for what's right, even if the path seems long and arduous. Justice may be delayed, but it can arrive for those who persistently seek it. Now, as I look out at a Serene Oaks truly living in peace and harmony, I want to hear from you. Does your neighborhood have an HOA? Have you ever encountered your own, Brenda, or Rick? What's the most ridiculous or unreasonable HOA rule you've ever come across? Share your stories, your experiences, and your own lessons learned in the comments below. Let's build a forum together, a community of informed residents who understand their rights and responsibilities, who know how to protect peace and fairness from those who twist rules to serve their own egos and thirst for power. If this story of Serene Oaks resonated with you, made you think, feel empathy, or even just brought a little satisfaction seeing bullies get their comeuppance, please give it a like and share it with your neighbors and friends. And don't forget to subscribe to hear more stories about everyday life, where sometimes the quiet confrontations and small actions of ordinary people can create significant change and profound meaning. Thank you for listening to our story. And always remember, in life, calm, preparation, and the courage to speak truth are often more powerful weapons than any bluster, intimidation, or false authority. So, you've just heard the story of Sarah, her brother Alex, and how they dealt with the abuse of power from Brenda and Rick in Serene Oaks. A quiet but powerful confrontation, right? But if you thought that story was intense, brace yourselves. Because the next story I'm about to share takes things to a whole different level, a much more dangerous one. Imagine this, not a silent standoff, but a loaded gun pointed point blank at a man's son, right in their own driveway, in broad daylight. The reason? A few inches of a truck tire overlapping the property line. And behind the gunman? None other than the smug HOA president, Barbara, and her self-styled security boyfriend. They thought they held the power of life and death in Willow Creek Estates. They thought they could bully anyone. But they made a fatal mistake. They messed with the wrong person. They didn't know the young man they were threatening wasn't just any resident. He was a Navy SEAL. What happens when HOA attorney meets one of the world's most elite soldiers? What happens when the clipboard carrier and the gun wielder provoke the wrong man? You definitely don't want to miss what happens next. Stick around, because we're diving into the story of Frank, Michael, and the battle for peace in Willow Creek Estates. Don't go anywhere. He pointed a loaded gun at my son, right in our own driveway, in broad daylight, all because his tires were sticking out a few inches. Behind him, Barbara, the self-appointed HOA president of Willow Creek Estates, stood with her clipboard and a smug smirk. The man with the gun? Her boyfriend, the self-proclaimed rule enforcer. They thought they ran this neighborhood, thought that clipboard and gun gave them absolute authority. But they picked the wrong damn fight. They didn't know my son, the returning soldier, was a highly trained Navy SEAL, calm under pressure, and legally armed himself. They were about to face the consequences. I, Frank, chose Willow Creek Estates as my retirement haven, seeking peace and quiet amidst the tree-lined streets and meticulously manicured lawns. It promised a slower pace of life, mornings sipping coffee on the porch, birdwatching, and maybe a gentle glide into my golden years. But nobody warned us about Barbara, the uninvited HOA president. At first, she was just a nuisance with petty notes, insinuating our flagpole was too tall or the garden gnome was non-compliant decor. We laughed it off, figuring she was bored. But boredom couldn't explain the fines that started appearing. $7 for a non-standard mailbox handle, then $200 because the garage door paint was an unapproved shade variation. She reveled in the power she held and wielded it mercilessly, like a blunt instrument. Barbara was the type who ran for HOA president unopposed, then immediately rewrote the bylaws to ensure no one could challenge her position. She dominated every meeting, unilaterally changed voting procedures, and ruthlessly quashed any dissent from neighbors who dared question her vision. Barbara wasn't just a neighbor, she was a miniature dictatorship. And then life in Willow Creek Estates gained a new element when Barbara started dating Dale. He didn't live here, wasn't a homeowner, yet he appointed himself the HOA's enforcement officer, a title I'm pretty sure Barbara invented. Suddenly, Dale was everywhere, cruising around in his beat-up golf cart, eyes scanning behind cheap sunglasses, knocking on doors in the name of enforcing rules about weeds or flower pot colors. Some older neighbors, perhaps lonely or intimidated, seemed to welcome the attention. But others, myself included, started feeling uneasy. Some even began locking their back gates, something unheard of in Willow Creek. The real tension began to escalate when my son, Michael, returned home from a long overseas deployment. Michael's a good kid, quiet, keeps to himself after everything he'd been through. He just wanted some peace, to help me with the lawn on weekends, and maintain his privacy. But Barbara took an instant dislike to him. She told neighbors Michael looked intimidating, that his pickup truck was oversized for the community standards, even though it was parked neatly within our driveway lines. We tried to ignore it, hoping she'd lose interest. But the complaints quickly turned into actions. The fines started piling up, leading to that fateful afternoon when Dale aggressively marched onto our driveway. To understand how things escalated to Dale confronting Michael, perhaps we need to rewind slightly, to the genesis of this tyranny. Because this tragedy, like many, didn't start with a gun, but with petty grievances and unchecked power. Before Dale arrived with his ego weaponized by Barbara's authority, she had already begun what I call her gentle tyranny. She took over the HOA 2 years prior in an election where no one else wanted to run. Our first mistake was letting that happen. Initially, it was standard stuff: community newsletters, holiday banners, gentle reminders about trash cans. But once Barbara got a taste of power, even the tiny power wielded in a quiet subdivision, it changed her. She started rewriting the bylaws like she was carving them in stone, turning Willow Creek Estates, a standard retirement community, into her personal fiefdom. It was already a quiet, predictable place, full of people who put up Christmas decorations too early and waved politely while silently judging the height of your lawn. Barbara, with her sun visor and stern demeanor, fit right in, until she decided she was queen. Her fining the Petersons for having an Elvis-themed garden gnome was just the beginning. Barbara's compliance crusade soon targeted us. The first time I knew I was in trouble was when she showed up at my door with a tape measure. "Just checking your mailbox height, Frank," she chirped with fake cheerfulness. "Seems to be about half an inch over regulation 3.4b. I tuned out. The result was a $50 fine. A week later, another fine, this time for an unauthorized visible garden hose. Apparently, my green garden hose disrupted the neighborhood's visual harmony, despite being used to water my roses in 85-degree heat. Barbara had unilaterally decided hoses should only be neutral colors. That was strike 2 against us. Strike 3 arrived when Michael came home. After stressful deployments in far-flung places, the last thing he wanted was HOA drama. When Michael parked his truck in our driveway, maybe the front tires nudged the line slightly, but still entirely on our property, Barbara was waiting, swooping in like a hawk. "It's too large," she declared flatly. "The tires exceed the designated parking boundary by 2 inches, and we don't allow vehicles of that size parked overnight." Michael just raised an eyebrow. "You mean my truck, legally parked on my family's private property?" Barbara smirked, as if she'd found a major legal loophole. "We'll be issuing a $170 citation." Michael didn't argue, just gave a curt nod. Calm. Too calm. And that calm started to worry me. Dale's arrival poured gasoline on the fire. Random inspections became daily occurrences. Dale and Barbara patrolled together, armed with clipboards, cameras, and what I swear was a plastic laminated HOA Bible. They knocked on doors, took pictures, fined people for everything from faded shutters to the wrong color patio cushions. Barbara called it beautification enforcement. We called it what it was, suburban surveillance. Through all this, Michael remained unnervingly quiet. But each night, I'd see him on his laptop, typing, reviewing, researching. The HOA bylaws and meeting minutes, it turned out, were public record. Michael, with his photographic memory and meticulous attention to detail honed by special operations, quietly started compiling everything: video footage from security cameras, email screenshots, dated notes on Barbara's biased and questionable decisions. The real turning point wasn't a specific object like a bird feeder, but Michael's defiant presence itself. Barbara clearly hated that he showed no fear or deference towards her. She started nitpicking everything about our property. The grass height was measured repeatedly, the trash placement complained about, even our porch light was deemed too bright, resulting in a $50 fine for light pollution. Michael's response was still just one word: okay. But this time, I knew that okay carried a different weight, a silent warning that something was coming. Soon after, Barbara had HOA surveillance cameras installed on a utility pole, and wouldn't you know it, they were all aimed squarely at our house. She claimed it was for community security. But the target was obvious. She accused us of disturbing the peace, simply because Michael sometimes worked on his truck in the garage in the evening. Next, she called an emergency board meeting, which she chaired and was the only voting member present for, naturally, to propose a draconian new rule about vehicle size permitted in public view, aimed squarely at Michael's truck. Michael filed a formal appeal. Barbara summarily denied it. He appealed again. She responded with a $500 fine for non-compliance with the new regulation. That night, I found Michael in the garage, not working on the truck, but organizing a binder thicker than a phone book. I asked what he was doing. "Just getting prepared, Dad," he said, eyes fixed on the papers. "Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who hasn't had their say yet." The neighborhood was now visibly fractured. We weren't the only ones being targeted, but many were too afraid to speak up. They feared the fines, the retribution, Dale, and Barbara's powerful clipboard. She had manipulated votes, rewritten the rules, and made herself the untouchable ruler. She had Dale, her custom bylaws, and a clipboard that held more menace than reason. What she didn't have, and didn't know she was facing, was Michael. Michael had something better than a clipboard. He had training. He had steel patience. And most importantly, he had proof. As the oppressive summer heat settled in, the air in Willow Creek estates felt thick with compression. The sense of community had evaporated, replaced by simmering tension and unspoken fear. Just when it seemed Barbara had run out of ridiculous rules to enforce against us, she found a new target, one that finally broke all bounds: our old dog, Buddy. Let me be clear, Buddy is a 12-year-old Labrador, slow with arthritis and more likely to be scared by a cat than a person. He's so gentle he wouldn't dare snatch a dropped cookie. Yet that didn't stop Barbara from filing a formal complaint for aggressive animal behavior. The reason? Buddy had let out a single bark, not at a child, not at a neighbor, but at a butterfly flitting through the yard. Barbara solemnly declared this a noise disturbance, violating some section 7.12 she'd likely invented, accompanied by a $200 fine and a chilling threat. "One more incident, and animal control will be notified." That was the moment I saw something in my son I hadn't seen since he'd returned. Michael's jaw clenched tight, his eyes went dark. I'd seen him handle dangers I couldn't imagine, but the only time I saw his hand tremble slightly was when Barbara threatened the well-being of Buddy, his loyal, aging companion. That night, the light in Michael's office burned late. He had printed the entire HOA covenant, every single page. Under his desk lamp, he meticulously red-penciled every violation Barbara herself had ignored on her own property: the non-compliant fence, the 2 trash cans instead of the mandated one, the backyard shed erected without a permit. Then he got up, not to go to bed, but to start knocking on neighbors' doors. The neighbors who had been silent out of fear began to talk. Michael, it turned out, wasn't the only one quietly documenting Barbara's tyranny. The Millers had audio recordings of Dale making inappropriate comments during a compliance check. The Petersons had security footage of Barbara trespassing at night to dig up their decorative plants she later fined them for letting die. Even sweet Mrs. Gable had saved every nonsensical fine she'd received, 27 in total, all vague and retaliatory. Michael collected it all: statements, photos, audio recordings, and compiled it into a meticulously organized, labeled, and time-stamped 48-page dossier. The next morning, he drove straight to the county HOA management office. The thing about power abusers is, when an HOA goes rogue and multiple households band together with documented proof, the higher-ups have to listen. Especially when one of the complainants is a decorated combat veteran who understands civic duty and isn't afraid to escalate to federal oversight agencies if necessary. Michael filed a formal complaint detailing the abuses of power, clear conflicts of interest, and potential gross violations of civil rights by Barbara and Dale. And he wasn't done yet. The emergency meeting Barbara called a week later was supposed to be a private affair, a chance for her to consolidate power and condemn the disruptive elements. But word had spread. When we arrived at the community clubhouse, it was packed, not just with HOA members but curious neighbors too. Barbara clearly hadn't invited us, but Michael attended anyway. He wasn't in uniform, just jeans and a t-shirt, but his presence, tall and silent in the back row, commanded attention. He was there not to provoke, but to remind everyone who he was, and that he wouldn't be bullied. Barbara stood at the podium, launching into her usual speech about the importance of compliance, the need to maintain Willow Creek Estates' aesthetic beauty, and hinting darkly at subversive elements, undermining harmony. The tension was palpable. As she finished, Michael calmly raised his hand. Every eye swiveled towards him. Barbara couldn't ignore him. "Yes, Mr. Miller?" she asked, her voice tight with forced casualness. Michael stood, his voice, though not loud, carried clearly in the silence. "Madam President, could you please explain how HOA funds, contributed by all of us, were used to pay for the recently installed surveillance camera system, which appears to be aimed solely at my family's property, without a community vote, prior notification, or any presented permits?" Barbara blinked, her face tightening with shock and anger. She stammered something about emergency powers and community security. But Michael held up a printed piece of paper. "This is a copy of the HOA bank statement," he said, his voice even. "Page 6. Check number 4889, signed by you, paid for security equipment. Purchased with community funds. Installed with no recorded approval in any meeting minutes." The air in the room turned thick. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, suspicious glances darting towards Barbara. Someone whispered loud enough for many to hear. "She used our money to spy on the Millers." Michael slowly sat back down, leaning back in his chair. He didn't need to say another word. The seed of doubt was sown. Barbara clearly couldn't abide the public challenge. The humiliation cut deep into her ego. The very next morning, the fallout arrived. Dale showed up at our house again, alone this time, but his expression even more aggressive and dangerous. Without a word, he marched straight onto our driveway where Michael's truck was parked, in the exact spot Barbara had previously fined him for. "I warned you about this damn truck," Dale snarled, pointing at the vehicle. Michael stepped out of the garage, empty-handed, placing himself between Dale and the truck. "You're trespassing on private property," Michael stated, his voice chillingly calm. Dale let out a distorted scoff. "I'm enforcement here. I have the right." And then, in a moment of crazed recklessness, Dale reached to his waistband, pulled out a black handgun, and aimed it squarely at Michael's chest. From the sidewalk across the street, I saw Barbara standing there, arms crossed, a faint, satisfied smirk on her face, as if watching a play she'd directed reach its victorious climax. But Michael didn't flinch. He didn't step back, didn't raise his hands. His eyes flicked rapidly, the gun, Dale's finger on the trigger, Dale's wild eyes, then back to Dale's face. He tilted his head slightly, an almost curious gesture. "You really want to do this?" His voice still holding that unnerving calm, a calm so profound it raised the hairs on my arms. Then he added, loud enough for Barbara to hear, "It's all being recorded." And it was. From 3 different angles, our doorbell camera, the security camera mounted on the garage, and the cell phone of the neighbor across the street, who was discreetly filming the entire encounter from behind her window curtain. There was something Barbara and Dale couldn't possibly know. Michael had filed for a restraining order 2 days prior, and a temporary protective order had been granted by the court that very morning, just hours before this confrontation. Which meant the instant Dale stepped onto our driveway, he was violating a court order. And pulling the gun constituted felony aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. All captured on video. Less than an hour later, 2 county sheriff's cruisers, real police officers, not self-appointed wannabes like Dale, screeched to a halt in front of our house. They weren't there to question Michael. They were there for Dale. He was handcuffed on the spot, right there in our driveway, as neighbors began to gather. Barbara shrieked nonsensical accusations, trying to explain, insisting Michael had set them up, but no one was buying it anymore. A few neighbors even clapped softly. In her panic and defeat, the ever-present clipboard slipped from Barbara's grasp, clattering onto the pavement. Michael quietly bent down and picked it up. His eyes scanned the top sheet, a flimsy financial report. Then he paused. Guess what? Barbara's signature was right there on a line item approving an unauthorized monthly management stipend for herself, a significant amount expressly forbidden by the HOA bylaws. We wouldn't even need to report that one. The investigators would find the rest. As for Barbara, she never saw failure coming. People like her, the clipboard tyrants, the ones who build their petty empires on manufactured rules and others' fear, never planned for the downfall. They only know dominance, unchecked control, ruling over minutiae like paint colors and grass height with absolute authority. But it turns out, even self-proclaimed HOA queens aren't above the law. And as for Michael, my son? Well, he decided playtime was over. You might think that after Dale was perp-walked in handcuffs right before her eyes, Barbara would have the sense to retreat, maybe lay low for a while, or at least stop poking the bear. Nope. The incident seemed only to fuel her bitterness and recklessness. Instead of silence, she doubled down, attempting to control the narrative. A mass HOA email blast went out that evening, under the grandiose title, "Maintaining Order in Turbulent Times." In it, she blatantly accused our family of aggressive behavior, claimed Michael had intentionally staged a fake incident to frame Dale, and brazenly implied our unpatriotic actions were threatening the safety and tranquility of Willow Creek Estates. Unpatriotic? She dared to accuse a Navy SEAL, a man who served multiple combat tours overseas, of being unpatriotic because he stood up to her tyranny? The audacity was breathtaking. But that email, that rambling, defensive screed filled with libelous accusations, was her final, fatal mistake. Because in her panic and hubris, she didn't just send it to the neighborhood residents. She carelessly CC'd it to the entire county HOA oversight board and, unbelievably, to Michael's lawyer. Yes. My son now had a lawyer. And not just any lawyer. He'd retained a civil rights attorney, known for being bulldog tough, who specialized in HOA overreach, illegal surveillance, and homeowner rights violations. Turns out, what Barbara and her clipboard had been doing wasn't just annoying, it was flagrantly illegal. Using community funds for personal purchases or unapproved projects? Illegal. Installing surveillance equipment targeting private property without consent or warrant? Illegal. Falsifying board votes by manipulating proxies or voting multiple times herself? Extremely illegal. Michael and his new attorney worked tirelessly, putting it all together, the baseless fines, the clumsily altered budget reports, the security footage of Barbara trespassing in neighbors' yards, and the very HOA rulebook Barbara had rewritten multiple times herself, riddled with conflicting dates and clearly doctored digital timestamps. They even served a subpoena for detailed HOA financial records and discovered a veritable treasure trove. Barbara had been quietly paying herself a monthly management stipend for the past 3 years. It totaled over $18,000 in community funds funneled into her personal account. Unapproved. Unauthorized. And, of course, never declared. It was the final nail in the coffin of her HOA career. When the county board finally convened a formal hearing regarding the allegations against Barbara, it was meant to be a closed session. But word spread like wildfire. So many residents from Willow Creek Estates showed up that they had to move the hearing to the town library's larger auditorium. Folding chairs were set up everywhere. People clutched printouts of ridiculous fines. Some even brought photos of damage caused by Barbara's enforcement. One man even brought his executed Elvis garden gnome as evidence. Michael sat quietly in the front row with his attorney. Barbara swept in, radiating her usual air of confidence, pearl necklace in place, as if attending a garden party rather than facing her downfall. She carried 2 yellow legal pads under her arm and looked utterly unrepentant. One crucial thing she didn't bring, a lawyer. Because right up until the end, Barbara believed she could talk her way out with bluster and faux authority. A grave miscalculation. The room fell silent as Michael, prompted by his lawyer, rose to speak. He didn't raise his voice, showed no anger or emotion. He simply, calmly, methodically laid out each of Barbara's violations, cross-referencing every statement with documented proof, precise timestamps, and irrefutable photographic evidence projected onto a large screen. His lawyer then played a short but devastating video montage, compiled from neighbor contributions, footage of Dale screaming at an elderly resident, Barbara sneaking around at 2 a.m. tearing down the Petersons' Halloween decorations, and audio from an HOA board meeting where Barbara brazenly cast 3 votes for herself using clearly falsified proxy ballots. Audible gasps filled the room. A woman in the front row clutched her pearls. Barbara started to sweat, her heavy makeup doing little to conceal the panic dawning on her face. Finally, Michael's lawyer solemnly handed the hearing board a thick binder, its cover labeled, "Chronicle of HOA Abuse, Willow Creek Estates, 2020 to 2024. Inside was everything: screenshots of threatening emails, audio recordings of confrontations, the detailed financial trail of the embezzled funds, and even a signed whistleblower letter from a former HOA treasurer Barbara had bullied into resigning 2 years prior. It was checkmate. There was no room left for doubt. The board recessed for 40 minutes to deliberate in private. When they returned, the lead investigator, a grim-faced man, didn't mince words. His voice rang out clearly. "Ms. Barbara Evans, after careful review of the evidence presented, the board has reached a unanimous decision. You are hereby removed from the position of president and all other roles on the Willow Creek Estates HOA Board of Directors, effective immediately. Further investigation into potential criminal charges will be referred to the district attorney's office." Barbara leaped to her feet, her face crimson with rage and disbelief. "You can't do this to me! I built this community!" she shrieked. But her cries were drowned out by applause that erupted throughout the room. Someone yelled from the crowd, "You built it on lies and fear!" Another held up a homemade sign, "Willow Creek is free!" Barbara, sputtering in incoherent fury and utter defeat, turned and stormed out of the room. The clipboard fell from under her arm again on her way out, landing forlornly on the floor. This time, no one bothered to pick it up for her. In the aftermath of the hearing earthquake, Willow Creek Estates began to heal and reform with astonishing speed. An interim HOA board was immediately appointed, composed of volunteer neighbors who actually cared about the community, not personal power. Their first order of business was to overhaul the draconian bylaws Barbara had imposed. In a community vote with record turnout, the ridiculous rules about garden hose colors, gnome sizes, and trash can placements were struck down. Sensible limits replaced absurd restrictions on vehicles parked on private property. Personal freedom and diversity were welcomed back. Simultaneously, a full, independent financial audit was launched into the HOA books covering Barbara's entire tenure. Unsurprisingly, it uncovered significant irregularities, providing solid corroboration for the formal criminal charges of embezzlement and fraud eventually filed against Barbara by the DA's office. Dale, her ex-boyfriend, also faced a slew of serious charges, including felony assault with a deadly weapon and violating a protective order. The wheels of justice, sometimes slow, were finally turning. As for our family, in a symbolic act, we installed a second flagpole in the front yard, right next to the American flag. On it, we raised the P.O.W/M.I.A. flag, a tribute we hadn't dared display before for fear of Barbara's complaints and fines. Now both flags flew proudly. Rumor had it that Barbara, forced to leave Willow Creek Estates, tried to start fresh in an upscale gated community in another state. Her efforts failed. Apparently, in the digital age, a bad reputation travels fast. A simple Google search of her name brought up the whole sordid story: local news articles about the hearing, leaked videos of her abuses, court findings, even mocking memes about her obsession with petty rules. Nobody wanted a Barbara in their neighborhood. She eventually ended up renting a modest apartment in a large, anonymous complex, one without an HOA. The irony was thick. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but in Willow Creek Estates, justice arrived not cold, but with the bang of a judge's gavel, clear court documents, and a new community newsletter simply titled, "Welcome back to Sanity." Just when we thought the saga was over, with Barbara vanquished and justice underway, we were wrong. Because, true to form for someone who never concedes defeat even when utterly beaten, Barbara decided on one final act of desperation and absurdity. Exactly 2 weeks after being removed from office and facing criminal indictment, she filed an audacious civil lawsuit against the entire Willow Creek Estates neighborhood. Yes, you read that right. She sued all of us, her former neighbors, demanding $250,000 for defamation of character infliction of emotional distress, and most laughably, the loss of her future leadership opportunities. She claimed her pristine reputation had been unjustly ruined, the videos shared online were maliciously edited to slander her, and that Michael had orchestrated a vindictive campaign to destroy her life. The frivolous lawsuit wound its way through the county court system. And once again, Michael found himself involved. This time, not as a complainant or defendant, but as the star witness for the legal team representing the Willow Creek Estates HOA. Because this time, Barbara wasn't just fighting one family. She was fighting everyone she had tried to control and bully. The trial lasted 4 days and became another Barbara-centric tragicomedy. Day 1 saw her lawyer, she hired one this time, trying to paint her as a victim of an online mob fueled by misinformation. Day 2 saw the HOA's lawyer, backed by testimony from over 30 residents, present a mountain of irrefutable evidence: the illegally cashed HOA checks for personal expenses, the clearly forged proxy ballots, proof of the illegal surveillance camera placements, detailed records of HOA fund misuse, including a $600 invoice for a brass president nameplate, and of course, the infamous unpatriotic email that had become evidence against her. Day 3 belonged to Michael. He took the witness stand, calm and collected as ever. There was no bitterness or anger in his voice, just the facts, presented clearly and coherently. He spoke of his years serving overseas, fighting for the very freedoms he came home to find being systematically stripped away by a power-hungry neighbor armed with forms, fines, and faux authority built on fear. He concluded his testimony with a simple but powerful statement that cut to the heart of the matter. "Your Honor, I didn't fight for this country overseas only to come home and have someone with a clipboard tell my father what color garden hose he's allowed to use." The courtroom was utterly silent. Even the judge paused for a moment, seemingly absorbing the weight of that statement. Day 4 brought the verdict, swift and decisive. Barbara's lawsuit was dismissed entirely, with prejudice, meaning she could never refile it. But that wasn't all. The court ordered Barbara to pay the entirety of the Willow Creek Estates HOA's legal fees, totaling $18,400, almost exactly the amount she had embezzled from the HOA funds as her management stipend over 3 years. Justice, in a way, had returned the stolen funds with interest. It was the final, definitive blow. Willow Creek Estates was officially Barbara-proofed. With Barbara's shadow completely lifted, the neighborhood didn't just recover, it thrived. The new, genuinely volunteer HOA board brought a breath of fresh air. They organized a huge block party, the first in years without the oppressive pall of rules and surveillance. Children's laughter echoed down the street again, dogs ran freely without fear of noise disturbance, fines, and wonderfully, garden gnomes made a triumphant return, including the Petersons. Elvis, restored to its place of honor. Michael was asked again to join the board, but he politely declined, saying he preferred contributing quietly. At the block party, however, someone presented him with a homemade wooden plaque reading, "Willow Creek Watchdog's Neighborhood Hero." He grinned, accepted it, and mounted it on the front porch, next to the 2 flags. Even Buddy, our old lab, seemed to walk with a lighter, happier step, as if a great weight had been lifted. Oh, and Michael's truck? It still sits there, in our driveway. Sometimes, maybe a tire still nudges the line. But now, nobody cares enough to bring out a tape measure. As for Barbara's legacy, or rather, lack thereof, whispers of her failed attempts to relocate still surface occasionally. It seems the name Barbara Evans became something of a cautionary tale in HOA circles. Word is she's living in obscurity somewhere far away, in a nameless rental, and most importantly, hopefully, clipboard-free. Weeks after the final court case ended, when the dust had settled and a sense of normalcy was taking root again in Willow Creek Estates, Michael and I took a walk through the neighborhood one evening. The tension was gone, replaced by the warm glow of sunset, the buzz of cicadas, and the occasional sprinkler kicking on. We passed the exact spot on our driveway where Dale had drawn the gun on Michael. Incredibly, the new HOA board had turned it into a small community hydrangea bed, a symbol of the change. We waved at the Millers, grilling in their backyard, the smell delicious on the air. Mrs. Gable, the elderly neighbor, sat on her porch swing, gently rocking with her cat curled in her lap. It felt blessedly normal. Michael stopped under the big maple tree on the corner, looking down the quiet street, then turned to me. "Funny, isn't it, Dad?" he said quietly. "How the peace feels almost louder, more powerful, than the chaos did." I nodded, knowing exactly what he meant. Especially when you have to fight for it, son. He smiled, a real, relaxed smile. Let's keep it this way. There's a unique, almost surreal kind of peace that comes after you've fought a ridiculous war over a clipboard and petty rules. It's the peace of finally being able to sit on your own porch without wondering if the color of your cushions violates some obscure bylaw regarding shades of beige. It's the truck parked on your property without fear of a fine for tires extending inches over a line. It's finding only junk mail and flyers in your mailbox, not threatening letters or baseless fines. But even now, as the sun sets over a much calmer, happier Willow Creek estates, my mind sometimes drifts back. I think about how close we came, as a community, to letting one person, just one person with a diseased thirst for power, turn our home into a landscape of fear and suspicion. And I think a lot about the hard-won lessons we all learned. Because this story isn't just about Barbara or Dale. It's about what can happen anywhere when we stop paying attention, when we get complacent, when we assume the people holding the clipboards and the titles always have our best interests at heart. It's about what happens when we let apathy and "not my problem" win. The first, and perhaps most crucial lesson, power abhors a vacuum. Barbara didn't just seize control of the HOA, we inadvertently handed it to her. By not showing up to meetings, by not voting, by rolling our eyes at the increasingly absurd rules and telling ourselves, "It's just petty stuff, who cares?" Well, Barbara cared. She cared immensely. And that's exactly how she turned landscaping guidelines into iron-fisted laws, and community management into personal dictatorship. If your neighborhood has an HOA, or is considering one, get involved. Know your bylaws. Read the meeting minutes. Ask who signs the checks. Because bad rules and abuses of power rarely happen overnight. They creep in quietly when no one is watching or willing to push back. Lesson 2. People like Barbara can't win if you document everything. Michael didn't win by shouting or meeting force with force. He won by creating an undeniable paper trail. Every screenshot, every threatening email, every questionable ballot, every suspicious expenditure was logged, printed, organized, and time-stamped. When it came time for the showdown, it wasn't his word against hers. It was irrefutable proof against theatrics and bald-faced lies. So, if you're dealing with a petty tyrant in your neighborhood, whether they wield a clipboard or just passive-aggressive notes, start keeping records. Log dates, times, specifics, take pictures if you can. Because the only thing more powerful than their bluster is their own actions objectively recorded on paper or digitally. Lesson 3. Community strength trumps autocratic control. The ultimate reason Barbara fell wasn't just Michael. It was the entire community finally waking up. The Millers, the Petersons, sweet Mrs. Gable, and so many others. The people who had been silent for too long finally saying, collectively, "Enough!" Once neighbors started talking to each other, sharing their stories, pooling their evidence, and standing together, the tyrant's walls started to crumble. Barbara's power was built on division and fear. Unity was its kryptonite. So, build your community before you need it. Have that block party, however simple. Talk to the neighbor 2 doors down. Share garden tools, gossip, a cup of coffee. Because organized, informed, and united neighbors are the worst nightmare for any wannabe Barbara. And the final lesson, justice can be slow, but it does grind forward. Honestly, there were times when it felt like Barbara was invincible, like she'd rule Willow Creek estates with her clipboard forever. And maybe you're reading this thinking, I have a Barbara in my neighborhood, and nothing ever happens to her. But trust me, time, evidence, and the legal system, flawed as it may be, eventually catch up to abusers. It might not always be as swift as we'd like, not always front-page news, but when the hammer finally falls, it often falls hard and decisively. Be patient, keep gathering proof, and don't lose faith. Now it's your turn. I've shared my family's story, our community's story. Now I want to hear yours. Leave a comment below and tell us, have you ever dealt with a Barbara, or a Dale, in your neighborhood? What's the most ridiculous HOA rule you've ever encountered? Or maybe you've served on an HOA board and tried to fix the mess left by a predecessor? We genuinely read every story shared. And who knows, maybe your HOA horror story will provide inspiration or a lesson for someone else, and maybe it will be the next story we tell here. So please, don't hesitate, share it below. Let's build a community of people who understand the fragile but crucial difference between enforcing reasonable rules and enforcing a pathological ego. And if this story made you laugh, cringe, or feel a little bit of righteous satisfaction at Barbara's downfall, show it some love with that like button, share it with your neighbors, maybe they need a little encouragement too, and be sure to subscribe for more stories about HOAs that you won't believe are real, but absolutely are. Thank you for listening to our story. And always remember, some of the greatest battles are fought on distant shores, but others, just as vital to our lives, are fought right here on our front lawns and driveways. And sometimes, the most powerful weapon isn't a gun, but the defiant calm staring down the bully's gun. You just heard the incredible story of the fiery confrontation at Willow Creek Estates, where a Navy SEAL faced down a loaded gun over a parking violation, and Barbara's empire came crashing down. Justice served, right? But do you think HOA battles always have to be this bloody and dramatic? Sometimes, the absurdity is quieter, the fight more subtle, but no less fierce. Don't go anywhere. Because up next, we're taking you right back to Willow Creek. But this time, the enemy isn't guns and goons, it's the clucking of hens? Hear the story of the Hayes family, who just wanted a few fresh eggs each morning from their perfectly legal chicken coop. But they ran afoul of the new HOA queen, Beatrice Sterling, who declared their silent hens were ruining her beauty, sleep, and property values. This isn't just about chickens. It's a battle of common sense versus peak absurdity. How does one family fight back against HOA bullying and outright lies? Stick around to find out in our next story, the chicken coop conflict. You won't believe it! All we wanted were a few fresh eggs each morning, a little slice of self-sufficiency in our new suburban backyard. Our small, perfectly legal chicken coop housed only hens. But when Beatrice Sterling, the unofficial queen of the HOA board, stormed over demanding it be torn down because imaginary rooster crows were disturbing her beauty sleep, I knew this wasn't just about chickens. This was a fight for what's right. Stick around to see how we navigated this ridiculous storm of unwarranted fury. For my family, my wife Clara, our 2 young kids, and me, moving to the quiet Willow Creek subdivision felt like finding an oasis. We craved a slower pace, fresh air, and wanted to teach our kids where food comes from. That's why we decided to build a small chicken coop in our backyard. We meticulously researched city ordinances, carefully reviewed the HOA covenants, measured setbacks, and ensured proper sanitation. 6 petite Sarama hens settled into their new home, promising a daily supply of fresh eggs. The neighborhood was lovely, with manicured lawns and well-kept houses. Most neighbors seemed friendly. We joined neighborhood barbecues, and the kids quickly made friends. We believed we were fitting in nicely, that our idyllic suburban dream was taking shape. Little did we know that this tiny, completely legal chicken coop was about to become the epicenter of an absurd battle we never saw coming. About a month after the hens settled in, the first official letter from the HOA arrived. It accused us of noise pollution and creating an eyesore, demanding we rectify the situation immediately. Noise pollution from hens that only clucked softly? It was absurd. A few days later, my wife, Clara, caught Beatrice Sterling, the HOA president, lurking at the edge of our yard, sneakily taking photos of the coop with her phone, her attitude clearly unfriendly. The next morning, she appeared aggressively at our gate, hands on hips, scowling. "Hayes family," she snapped. "That structure has to go. The rooster crowing disturbs my precious sleep and that of many others. That barnyard noise lowers the value of the estates around here." I tried to remain calm, explaining. "Mrs. Sterling, we only have hens. They don't crow. The coop is fully compliant with regulations." I offered copies of our permits. She waved them away dismissively. "I don't care. It has to go." Just then, Mr. Chin, our elderly neighbor across the street, came out to water his plants. He glanced quickly at Sterling, then at me, giving a subtle, sympathetic shake of his head before turning back inside. A small gesture, but it told me I wasn't the only one who saw the absurdity. My polite refusal apparently just fueled Mrs. Sterling's fury. She immediately launched a campaign of personal harassment targeting my family. Nearly every morning, a bizarre ritual began. She'd stand near her property line, staring intently into our backyard, and then start loudly berating us about the non-existent noise pollution, accusing us of destroying the sacred tranquility of our upscale neighborhood. Her behavior wasn't just bizarre, it felt deeply unsettling and invasive. Feeling the need to protect my family and the truth, I decided to install a small, discreet security camera aimed at our backyard and the fence line where she frequently stood. The purpose wasn't to spy, but to objectively document this repeated harassment. Simultaneously, I started having quiet, discreet conversations with other neighbors we felt comfortable with, wanting to understand if anyone was genuinely bothered. The truth gradually emerged, completely contradicting Sterling's claims. She kept insisting, many people were complaining, that the whole neighborhood was upset. But when I spoke with the Millers down the street, they seemed genuinely surprised. "Your chickens? Honestly, we never hear a thing." Mrs. Sterling did stop by to ask, but we told her plainly we weren't bothered at all. Another neighbor, looking hesitant, whispered that Sterling had tried to pressure them into signing a formal complaint, but they'd flatly refused, finding the request ridiculous. Then one evening, coming home, I found a small, folded piece of paper slipped discreetly under my door. Anonymous, just a few hastily scribbled lines. "Mrs. S. is pushing hard with board members to fine you heavily at the next meeting. She's outright lying about who's actually complaining. Be careful." This small note was significant. It confirmed that even within the HOA, not everyone blindly followed or agreed with the president's actions. At this point, the bigger picture snapped into focus. This wasn't some complex conspiracy to seize land or protect property values. This was simply a blatant abuse of power, driven by the petty vindictiveness of one individual who couldn't stand someone defying her autocratic will, even when they were fully compliant with the law and community rules. Beatrice Sterling was turning a trivial matter, a small hen house, into a bitter personal vendetta. We prepared for the fateful HOA board meeting with a solemnity usually reserved for battle. However, our weapons weren't shadowy schemes or bombastic rhetoric, but simply the truth, clearly and irrefutably presented. Clara had meticulously organized a neat file, copies of the city ordinances regarding small fowl in residential areas, the specific clauses within Willow Creek's own HOA bylaws permitting it under certain limits, which we strictly adhered to, and of course, the official permit from City Hall certifying the coop's legality. Alongside these was a concise printout on hen biology, emphasizing the obvious but apparently necessary fact: hens don't crow. But the ace up our sleeve, the unshakable evidence, resided on my small tablet, the objective footage captured by the security camera we'd reluctantly installed. That footage documented, in undeniable detail, Beatrice Sterling's furious tirades and baseless shouting directed at our backyard, towards hens that were calmly scratching the dirt. To bolster this, we also had the private, informal confirmations from trusted neighbors like Mr. Chin and the Millers that they had never been bothered and certainly hadn't complained. Now, juxtaposing this simple evidence against Sterling's actions and words, the picture of a malicious personal campaign became painfully clear. It was obvious she had deliberately fabricated a false narrative, an elaborate charade serving her own agenda. She had inflated faint, barely audible clucking into unbearable noise pollution, twisted non-existent complaints, even outright refusals to complain, into strong community opposition. She had tried to brand our small, clean, and legal coop a grave threat to the property values of the surrounding million-dollar estates. All for one purpose: to force my family to bow to her arbitrary will, to remove what she perceived as a personal challenge, regardless of rules or reason. The scale of this plot wasn't in its complexity or network, but in its sheer audacity and extreme personalization. She was willing to distort truth, pressure others, and abuse her position as HOA president simply to satisfy her need to win and her bruised ego. Although we didn't have a powerful retired judge living next door like in some stories, we did have right and truth on our side. In the days leading up to the meeting, we took a careful step. We had brief, private chats with Mr. Chin, the Millers, and a couple of other households we trusted. We showed them copies of the regulations, briefly explained the situation, and crucially, showed them a short video clip of Sterling yelling at the fence. Their reactions were nearly identical: initial utter surprise, followed by clear indignation. "She really does that?" Mrs. Miller exclaimed, incredulous. "That's just unacceptable." Mr. Chin simply shook his head, disappointment clear in his eyes. This quiet support, though not publicly voiced at that moment, gave us invaluable moral strength, confirming we weren't alone in this fight for fairness. On the evening of the HOA meeting, the air in the community room was thick with tension. About 30 residents were present, significantly more than usual. People sat quietly, their curious and expectant gazes fixed on the long table where the board sat. Beatrice Sterling occupied the center seat, spine rigid, attempting to project calm authority, but her occasionally clenched hands betrayed her inner anxiety. As the meeting commenced, following the usual procedures, she cleared her throat and began her carefully prepared speech. Her voice rang out, striving for dignity and responsibility, speaking of the need to maintain the highest standards for the prestigious Willow Creek community, to protect the shared aesthetics and tranquility everyone valued. Then she shifted gears, her tone growing more serious, focusing on the grave issue that, according to her, jeopardized all those values: the Hayes family's chicken coop. She described it as a persistent nuisance, an unacceptable source of noise pollution, and a dangerous precedent that could severely diminish property values throughout the neighborhood. Finally, she formally proposed that the board vote to impose a substantial financial penalty, applied daily, for our failure to comply with the demand to remove the offending structure. She spoke with near absolute confidence, certain her proposal would pass easily. After Sterling concluded, it was our turn. Clara, with surprising composure, stepped forward. She showed no sign of buckling under the pressure. In a clear, steady voice, she presented the valid permits from the city, pointed out the specific clauses in the HOA bylaws allowing hens within small limits and with proper sanitation. She emphasized that we had complied with every requirement regarding distance, coop size, and cleaning procedures. Then it was my turn. I explained, simply and scientifically, the fundamental difference between hens and roosters, stressing that only roosters crowed in the morning, while our petite Sarama hens only emitted very soft clucks, barely audible outside our yard. Then I addressed the core issue, the complaints. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, striving for a neutral tone. Mrs. Sterling has repeatedly mentioned numerous neighbor complaints about our coop. However, in our own inquiries, we've had the chance to speak with several surrounding households, and it seems the reality might not be quite as presented. I paused briefly, letting the words sink in. The atmosphere in the room began to shift. Soft murmurs started. A few people exchanged questioning glances. Sensing the change, I continued. And regarding the so-called noise pollution, in fact, after careful observation, we've found that the primary and most disruptive source of noise in recent weeks doesn't seem to be coming from the hens. That's when I raised my tablet and connected it to the projector. The large screen at the front of the room lit up. The room fell utterly silent as the video began to play. Clear footage showed Beatrice Sterling, their esteemed HOA president, day after day, standing at the dividing fence, red-faced, pointing, and relentlessly spewing angry words about the hens, who were completely silent, contentedly scratching in their coops several yards away. The captured audio was also crystal clear, dominated solely by Sterling's accusatory shouting, with absolutely no rooster crows. The contrast between her baseless fury and the chicken's tranquility was stark, almost comical if it weren't so disturbing. The room was stunned silent for several seconds after the video ended. Then, the earlier murmurs grew into audible discussion. All eyes swiveled towards Sterling, who sat frozen in her chair, her expression shifting from flushed anger to pale shock and humiliation. The oppressive silence was broken by the voice of Mr. Miller, the neighbor Sterling had unsuccessfully tried to recruit for her complaint. He stood up, looking directly at Sterling. "Beatrice," he said, his tone undisguised displeasure, "I think that video shows us all where the real problem lies. The Hayes family has clearly followed all the rules. The behavior we just witnessed is what's concerning." His words acted like a starting gun, shattering the silence and hesitation. Mrs. Miller stood too, adding, "That's right. We live right nearby and have never been bothered by any chicken noise. We made this clear to Beatrice when she asked." Several others, who had previously only exchanged glances, now spoke up, confirming they weren't disturbed and found Sterling's demands unreasonable. The wall of lies she had painstakingly constructed was crumbling before everyone's eyes. Sterling tried desperately to recover. She shot to her feet, her voice cracking with anger and shame. "That video is edited. They staged it to defame me. This is a deliberate act of disruption." But her words now rang hollow, unconvincing. The evidence was too clear, and the testimony of credible neighbors spoke volumes. No one in the room, not even the other board members at her table, looked convinced by her weak defense. When it came time to vote on Sterling's proposed fine, a heavy silence filled the room. The HOA secretary asked if anyone supported the motion. Not a single hand went up. The proposal died instantly. It was a total defeat, a public, humiliating rebuke for the powerful president. The meeting concluded shortly thereafter in an atmosphere thick with awkwardness and embarrassment for Sterling. For my family, it was a moment of profound relief, a feeling that justice, however small, had finally been served. We had faced the storm and held firm, armed with the truth. In the aftermath of that dramatic HOA meeting, the fallout for Beatrice Sterling was quiet but profound. The unofficial power she had wielded in the Willow Creek community seemed to evaporate overnight. Her usual commanding presence was replaced by a hesitant, almost evasive demeanor. Gone were the arbitrary orders and dictates, replaced by a notable silence. Rumors quickly spread that she was seriously considering stepping down from the board at the end of her current term, a quiet retreat rather than continuing to face a community now aware of her tactics. Although no official sanctions were imposed, no fines, no censures, the sheer public humiliation before her neighbors, who had witnessed the truth laid bare, seemed punishment enough. That public shaming significantly undermined her standing. Shortly thereafter, the HOA board, perhaps to smooth things over and re-establish order, sent out a general email to all residents. The content neutrally reminded everyone of the existing rules regarding small pets and livestock in the subdivision, outlining the permitted conditions and limits. While not directly mentioning our family or the specific incident, the message was implicitly understood as an indirect validation of our right to keep the coop. What was truly exposed wasn't a complex criminal network, but the truth about Sterling's volatile temperament and autocratic behavior. The facade of a dedicated community leader had crumbled, revealing someone who abused power for personal reasons. For many neighbors who had previously felt intimidated or railroaded by her, this exposure brought a sense of relief. The subtle atmosphere of fear diminished, and people felt more comfortable expressing their own opinions. Our family's ordeal unexpectedly became an object lesson for the neighborhood about the limits of HOA power and the vital importance of verifying information before making judgments or pressuring others. Residents began paying closer attention to the actual content of the bylaws and how they were interpreted and enforced. Though no new rules were enacted, the general awareness of fairness, mutual respect, and the need for clear evidence was significantly raised. In the days following the meeting, we received quite a few sincere apologies from neighbors who had previously chosen silence, expressing regret for not speaking up in our support sooner. For my family, justice was ultimately served, not through harsh penalties for Mrs. Sterling, but by the restoration of our peace. We could live in our home, tending to our small, legal flock of hens, without the constant fear of shouting matches or threatening letters. It was vindication for doing what was right, confirmation that we were correct to stand firm for our legitimate rights. The hens still clucked contentedly in the yard, entirely unaware of the storm they had inadvertently caused, and the fresh eggs each morning remained a sweet reward, a daily reminder of the victory of truth and reason. Sterling's credibility imploded, not due to a large-scale investigation, but simply because her own unreasonable actions were laid bare for all to see. For us, the real victory wasn't in taking her down, but in successfully defending our legitimate rights. Unexpectedly, through this small battle, the Willow Creek community seemed to grow stronger, with people seemingly braver about standing up for what's right. After Sterling quietly faded from leadership at the end of her term, the newly elected HOA board proved much more reasonable and communicative, bringing a breath of fresh air to the neighborhood. The old rule, which allowed hens within certain limits and was now respected again, became a reminder of the necessary balance within a community. Instead of being viewed as a potential nuisance, our little coop occasionally turned into a point of pleasant interest. Neighbor kids sometimes peered curiously over the fence at the small hens, and we happily shared fresh eggs with Mr. Chin, the Millers, and other kind neighbors who had offered quiet support. You should see our backyard now. The very hens Sterling despised and tried so hard to banish are still there, happily scratching for worms under the trees. Their quiet, peaceful presence doesn't diminish anyone's property value. If anything, some neighbors have remarked that it adds a touch of rustic charm, an interesting feature to the home. It turns out that a little bit of authentic country life, when managed properly, cleanly, and responsibly, can indeed be welcomed and even appreciated in a suburban setting. Every morning when I step into the backyard, the feeling of dread about a potential confrontation is completely gone. It's replaced by genuine peace, the only sounds being the gentle clucking of the hens and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Sterling tried to weaponize the HOA's power to impose her unreasonable will on my family. But instead of intimidating us into submission, her actions inadvertently became a catalyst, connecting us more deeply with good neighbors and serving as a living testament that truth and persistence can eventually overcome bullying. Sometimes the biggest, most meaningful lessons come from the smallest seeming battles. And the true suburban dream, perhaps, isn't about sterile uniformity and identical perfect lawns, but about respecting diversity, fairness, and reason in a community that knows how to listen and understand. But what if, next time, the HOA's target isn't a chicken coop, but a piece of your family history? A century-old oak tree, a symbol spanning 3 generations, forced to be cut down for flimsy reasons involving leaves and aesthetics? The next story I have to tell is even more intense. We had to watch helplessly as our heritage was destroyed by the tyranny of HOA President Eleanor Vance. But in that moment of loss, right beneath the felled tree, we stumbled upon a rotten secret, an illegal, private sewer line benefiting the very person who forced our hand. Are you curious what we did with the perfect opportunity for payback, to turn our pain into a precise strike, severing our bully's secret escape route? Stick around, because this revenge plot will make you question the line between justice and satisfaction.